I find it consistently perplexing which ideas, anecdotes, stories, if you will, get stuck in my mind and seemingly stay there. A lot of times they'll be about things that I have just no interest in. And yet they are a concrete structure of thought that are there, seemingly of their own accord, almost as if they have an agency all their own. For some reason, during the research and formulation of this episode, one of these stories or anecdotes just kept popping up over and over and over again, and I have no idea why it did, but it felt like one of those things that I absolutely had to share, and I was trying to figure out in formulating this episode where to put it. For some reason, this anecdote needed to make itself known somehow for this episode, and I figured out that I had to start with it. This is how this episode must begin. Perhaps that's why this particular anecdote or story lodged itself in there. It was because I needed to share it for the beginning of this episode somehow. Somehow it just knew that I would have struggled on how to begin this episode, and this story lived in my head for this moment, for this specific situation, for this episode. I'm not sure where exactly I came across this story. I can, in a way, broadly point to the period of my life when it would have happened. I probably would have been in between the ages of 14 and 16 years old. That's right, this story, this mental anecdotal structure has been in my memory since I first came across it. The source is a kind of a strange one, particularly for folks that know me. The source itself comes from a law enforcement official. To be specific, it actually comes from a criminal profiler for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a gentleman by the name of John Douglas, who's written quite a few books about psychological profiling for, I'm just going to say, insane serial killers. His specialty, for the most part, and the thing that made him very famous, was psychological profiling of pretty much the most evil people that have been alive over the last 70 years. But that has nothing to do with the anecdote, the story that John shared that is stuck in my mind that I'm going to share with all of you now. John Douglas is a pretty good storyteller. At least I think so, and his writing is very good. I believe he has assistance from another author by the name of Mark Alshaker. So I'm just going to quote the anecdote, this story, this thing that just, for some reason, keeps poking me in the ribs. Say, you need to share me now, because this story has something to do with what you want your listeners to understand. Here's the story, and these are the words of FBI criminal profiler John Douglas. It happened in Detroit on a Super Bowl Sunday in 1972. FBI headquarters had ordered a cross-country gambling raid, looking to rope in 1,000 bookies and shut down as many parlors as possible in a one-day raid. 1/3 of those arrests were expected to come out of the Detroit office. The gambling houses would need to be hit hot and fast, since they were always on the lookout for such attacks, especially on high-level gambling days like Super Bowl Sunday. I made 3 arrests that day, but one of these arrests changed the course of my life. His name was Frank, and he was in his early 30s, and we put him in the back seat of an unmarked car, and I eventually got in and sat next to him. He looked like a young Steve McQueen, thin, strong, and cool, and we had just taken down his gambling house. He was staring out the car window, a heavy rain pouring down around us. We had a few minutes before we were going to take him downtown and book him. But I took some time, and I looked at him, and I asked, "Why do you do this shit? Every year or so you get arrested. The rest of the time, always wondering when we're going to come through that front door. Sometimes end up doing a few years in jail. What's the point of it all?" Frank glanced over at me and smiled. "You don't get it, do you, kid?" he said. He turned back towards the window, raindrops streaking down the sides of the glass. "Pick out one of those raindrops, and I'll pick another. And I'll bet you any amount that mine makes it to the bottom before yours. You see my point? We don't need a Super Bowl. All we need are 2 raindrops. That's the story. And that's the one that, for some reason, just keeps shouting at me, saying, why don't you share me? And the reason that was very important for John Douglas is different than the reason that I think I need to share it for this episode. For John, this interaction with Frank showed him that some people just can't change. They are who they are. But for me, I think I abstract a different meaning from this, one which is very much in line with today's topic. Because while gambling and seeing the future have been very earnest yet strange bedfellows since, well, the very inception of either. For us, for human beings, throughout this long duration of recorded history, we have been able to see the future, or at least been able to think that we can glimpse it in almost anything. And we will, with absolutely everything. That, just like gambling as shared by Frank, because we can, humans will use anything as a divinatory tool. We can see the future in every development or aspect that surrounds us. Some of these are a bit more long-tenured than others. The vehicle via which we do them, they come and they go. Some are certainly more fascinating than others. Some of these vehicles seem to us now in this day and age to be absolutely abhorrent. Things like animal guts. But while we live in the present and we can remember the past, for us, all we have left besides this very moment that we live in, which is gone the moment we try to capture it, the only thing we have left is the future. And we'll see it in anything we want to. Skeptics these days would think that such behavior, and again, it's a very long-tenured behavior within humanity to be able to try and do this and abstract a future from the flimsiest of things, is superstitious nonsense for the most part. It's a thing that we do just to make ourselves feel better. Hell, sometimes it's just because we're bored or we want to have fun. And I use that term flimsy in a very purposeful way, because one of the most fascinating and without a doubt most popular ways in which we engage in a divinatory process here in the West has been through a vehicle that initially started with the thing that relates right back to that anecdote, and that's games and gambling. But let's be a bit more specific here. It's been through cards, through symbols and suits and figures and ink and the flimsiest and most disposable of materials, packed tightly together, seemingly of the same size, shuffled, bent, dog-eared, delightful. How on earth did these things come to show us our future? And how exactly is it that they continue to do so with such enduring prevalence? My name is Douglas Batchelor, and you are listening to What Magic Is This Podcast, a podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. And it's time to get all of these out from our sleeves And on the table for today, I'd love to talk about a history of cardamancy. I'd like to begin by talking about some personal details, nothing too specific. And I'm doing this in hopes that people can relate in some way. And maybe, certainly people my age can relate. I'm not too sure about the generation that's coming after me, what their interests are for the most part. But maybe they can relate in some way. All I can say is that when I look back at the first 30 years of my life, I'm only 42, but the first 30 years of my life, I cannot stress how important it was for me, the role that playing card games with others had in my life. I know I shared an episode, not the last one, but maybe the one before that, about thinking of that moment that you would look forward to all year, that occurrence that would occur every year that was your absolute favorite. And for me, it was a treasure hunt that my dad would put on Halloween. But coming in at a very close second would be card games with my family, my extended family, cousins, aunts, uncles, things of that. And they tend to happen very specific times, Christmas or Easter, but just any time that my family would get together on both sides of my family, we would play card games for hours and hours and absolute hours. I know perhaps some of you are like, yeah, my family did the same. I want to just say this, and hopefully this doesn't sound like too much of an exaggeration. Sure, your family probably played cards a lot. My family, it was like a near religion because both sides of my family were heavily involved in the military. And apparently here in Canada, the military was people that were in the Canadian Armed Forces. Before then, we had an Air Force. Anyways, if you were in the military, you had to know card games. You had to know at least 25 different card games. You needed to know the rules inside and out. In fact, the obsession with card games within the military was so deeply sewn into my family that there's a game that both sides of my family would play called euchre. And one side of my family played the game a certain way with very concrete, firm rules. And then the other side of my family played the same game, but with very different, but still very firm and unbending rules. And when I would try to get the rules from one side of the family to a different side of the family, I'd talk about, okay, can we play it this way? The other side of my family would be disgusted. They'd be they'd shake their head. It was an affront in every way, shape, or form, the way that one side of my family played euchre as compared to the other side of the family and how they played the game. One of my uncles, euchre was his thing. That was what we did when we spent time with him. He was basically a second father to me, passed away over a decade ago now. It's been hard because playing that game, it's just not the same without him. There's something so deep about that connection and then just the way that game was such a huge part of his life and the way he played it. And yes, I would look forward all year long to when my family would get together, Uncle Roger included, and we'd play the game of euchre. Usually with, certain combinations of teams, certain, I'd pair up euchre, you play with a partner. And it would be one of those things where when the younger cousins in my group, when they'd start to come up, they'd get an interest in playing cards too, and you kind of have to usher them in. It's one of these things that seems, in retrospect, so ridiculous to try and explain to other people, just the importance that these games had for our family and for myself. This was very, very important stuff, and it was not to be taken lightly, but we would always have a great time. We'd always have so much fun when we were doing it. The most fun, truly, just the greatest moments, the camaraderie, the jokes, the memories. We'd play a game that would be fairly memorable, and we'd remember the next year. You know, remember when this happened? My God, we did 10 tricks in a row. You guys didn't get a single point. Do you remember that? What power do these things have over us? I have to think. And here's the other odd thing. And this is going on for quite some time, but I'm just going to try, and again, hopefully you can relate. I don't like gambling. I've been to a casino once in my life. I don't enjoy it. It doesn't seem fun to me because the game's not the thing. The game is fun, but it's who I'm with. It's got nothing to do with money. We would sometimes gamble, but that wasn't where we derived our enjoyment. That was not where the importance of these things resided. It was who we were with, the circumstance, and the joyousness. That's something that gambling at a place or somewhere else doesn't give you that. But I was obsessed. I had little, before smartphones and things of this variety, you'd have to buy these little battery-operated, handheld, electronic little doohickeys. And they'd have like one card game, sometimes two, but usually just one kind of card game on there. I had one for 7-card stud poker. I had one for 5-card draw. I had a few others. I forget which games were on there anyways. But other kids had, their Game Boy and Game Gear. I also had a Game Gear, I'm not going to lie. But a lot of times, my favorite little handheld thing to play with would be those electronic card games. Family's got a long trip. We got a long drive ahead of us, 16-hour drive. Got up early in the morning. I made sure that I had at least 5 of these little devices that I could switch in between and just fiddle with in the back of the vehicle. All of this is to say that cards have been such a foundational part of my development. And even playing cards amongst friends once I left home and was living on my own was still very, very, very important to me. The older I get and the more I look back and reminisce, and you all know me, I look back with a sense of enchantment and with that sense that perhaps these things aren't as benign and uninvolved as just, it's your culture likes cards, your family likes cards, so therefore that's why you like cards. It's as simple as that. I don't know if it is as simple as that. I actually think these flimsy, disposable, stacked bits of paper are magical, truly, and it's not just because of the fact that they're the ones that bring people to the table and they have wonderful experience. You know me. I think it goes deeper than that. And here's the main thesis for this entire episode. You ready for it? Here it is. Since its inception, at least here in the West specifically, stacks of specially prepared card stock with intricate symbols on them from the very beginning, the very inception, the very moment that they came to Europe were magical objects used for magic, used for omens and divination. Period. That's it. Playing cards have always been magical. But as far as cards used in order to be a divination tool in this thing that we call cardamancy, what is the history of such a practice? Now, I know some of you might say, well, Doug, you've already done an episode on cardamancy. It was a while ago. In fact, it was, I think, maybe it was within my first 25 episodes. It was only like an hour long. Certainly not going to be as specific as this episode, but there's still good information in there. Some of this is going to be a little bit of not very much. Everybody just relax. But some of this is just going to be a retread of some of the things that I talk about in that episode, particularly the history element of it. But for the most part, this is just going to be far more specific, with me just trying to provide a bit more context and try and get the importance of these ideas of these things as cards cards being used as a divinatory tool in your head in a way that you can definitely relate to nowadays. Also, in a way, it is going to be a bit of a sister episode to that episode I did a couple of years ago called A History of Tarot. Again, some of the information is going to be a little bit of a crossover, not too much of a retread, but just because for the most part, and when we look back, tarot and those things that we call like playing cards or how playing cards exist in your mind right now, it's in a way kind of up to debate what came first. All right. I know some scholars probably or people that are academics listening. Yes, because there's a ton of them that do that to this show. Anyway, they might be like, well, hold on there. I mean, if we're only talking in a Western context, playing cards definitely came before tarot cards. I'm not too sure. We'd have to get really specific. What makes tarot cards? Is it the trumps or is it the suits, right? Because, at least for our purposes, where I like to consider ourselves as point zero, those cards, for the most part, they're very tarot-ish. All I can say is that there's a ton of debate around all of this kind of stuff. This episode is not the history of playing cards, although that would be a fascinating episode. That is not my wheelhouse, as much as I love playing cards. As you all heard, I love this stuff. But this episode specifically is about the use of cardstock in order to gain an oracle, in order for it to be used as a divinatory tool. For the most part, I'm actually kind of shocked that there's not really a comprehensive book about cardamancy, the history of cardamancy. I thought for sure, because it is such a fascinating subject, that there'd be tons of books. And Oxford would have a book about the history of cardamancy. Cambridge would have a book about the history of cardamancy. Nothing. And that to me is so unbelievably bizarre. So for the most part, I use a couple of sources for this episode, not, a series of books, unfortunately. And I have a couple of books that I use, but the main source for this episode, the one who should get all of the credit for taking a lot of research and kind of putting it in one place, is the eminent scholar of tarot and cards and cardamancy in general. That is Mary K. Greer. If you like tarot, and if you like cardamancy, and you have not gone to Mary K. Greer's tarot blog, wow, you're missing out. There's some awesome stuff there. It's just a treat to click around and see all of the stuff. And it's an older blog. It's been around for quite some time, and it's just great. Mary does fantastic work. Again, most of the credit for this episode. This episode does not exist if it's not for the research and the information that Mary has on her blog. Of course, that'll be the first link that comes up in the show notes for this episode. All right, let us head to that thesis once again. From the outset, these stacks of paper, all the same size, used to be shuffled, held in your hands, flipped over and put on a table or on a surface anywhere. They are magical from the outset. We all know what cardamancy is, right? I don't have to go through that again. It's using cards, any kind of cards, for divinatory purposes. Tarot cards are a form of cardamancy. That's the one that everybody knows, but people have been using regular old playing cards for cardamancy as well. People use things like oracle cards for cardamancy. For this one, I'm going to specifically try to hone in on forms other than tarot, because I've already gone through the tarot history, right? And as specific as tarot is, and everybody wants to know about tarot, I still think that there's other forms of using cards for divinatory purposes that are as interesting as that of the tarot. Origins. Let's get to the very, very beginning. Now, this is not an episode about the history of playing cards, but we do have to talk about playing cards because, again, my thesis. Lots of scholarly debate as far as the scenarios via which these playing cards came from the East, which is where they came from. I talked about it a little bit in an earlier episode. There was this kind of money cards that were used for gambling, and the cards were part of the gambling, and they were a kind of currency. That was, of course, in China. Eventually, something akin to those those stacks of paper drifted through trade routes and found their way going through Mesopotamia. We are not totally sure as to the scenario via which they got to Europe. What we do have, for the most part, is a collection of literary references, and these are fairly early, 14th century or so, and they say something about a game, and this specific kind of game was introduced by a Saracen, or it was also referred to as the Moorish game. Saracen is a term that was used particularly during the Crusades for anybody from the Arab Peninsula. Most scholars seem to think that playing cards, what we would recognize as playing cards, most likely started to really flourish in and around the middle of the 14th century. So we're talking about 1350 or so. Most likely it came to Europe through Moorish Spain. But we all know how historians like to show like roots. There's just one point. It could have also been that playing cards and things of this variety kind of sponged in, kind of creeped in through Europe, through several places. But one place that we really like to point to, particularly because of its association with the East, is, of course, Moorish Spain. And there's a reason for that, because I'm going to talk about a deck that we have that is very Moorish. We should all know about the Moors, right? You know, Northern Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. Now in Spain, during the Middle Ages, they were predominantly Muslim. So anyhow, yes, you had the connection from the East, but somewhat further in what would be Western Europe, or what we consider Western Europe now. A lot of the culture from the East, because of the religious connection, the Muslim connection, would have brought certain traditions and certain things from the East to a place like the Iberian Peninsula. Again, now that's Spain. And most definitely, I think the reason that a lot of scholars point to this is that things like games and playing cards would have definitely been one of these major cultural imports. What did these cards look like for the most part, and how does it relate to cardamancy? Well, I've talked about this quite a bit. We don't have a ton of they're very rare, the earliest forms of Eastern playing cards. But what we do have is a 16th century facsimile of a deck that I love talking about, and I've mentioned it on more than one episode. This is known as the Mamluk deck. Another refresher, everybody, the Mamluks, they were slave soldiers, and for a period of time, they ruled Egypt. They got so powerful that they ruled Egypt for well over 300 years, called themselves the Mamluk Sultanate, right? And this particular deck is one in which there are no, with regular playing cards, we have things like king, queen, jack, of course, because of the religious prohibition of the depiction of human figures within Islam. They didn't have those, but what they did have is they had certain suits. And again, what were these suits? Relating back to the tarot. Okay, so you've got scimitars or swords, you've got coins, you've got chalices or cups, and then you have sticks. We think they might be polo sticks, but of course that would probably shift to things like wands or staffs. Those are the tarot suits, right? These cards are exceptional. I love looking at this 16th century version of the Mamluk deck. I would encourage all of you to have a look at them. They are absolutely beautiful. And I've talked about these cards in plenty of places because they are very, very important and they indicate so much to us. But one thing that I have not mentioned, which is why I have to mention it here in this cardamancy episode, and this relates back to the thesis, is that you will notice when you look at these cards that it's not just the artistic depiction of the suits that they have and the wonderful flourishes of things like flowers and whatnot, but at the top and the bottom of the cards, there are words. There's Arabic calligraphy. Now, I want to make this clear, just so people won't say, Doug, you're getting a little bit out of your lane here, and perhaps, you know what, maybe I might be. We don't exactly know if the deck that we do have, the one that is the infamous Mamluk deck, if it was indicative of decks that were coming from the East all the way since the 10th century. We just don't have enough decks to say that the calligraphy that exists on these cards would be standard. Yet, from the few examples that we have of late 15th century, early 16th century Mamluk playing cards, the calligraphy is there for the most part. All right, what exactly would these things on the cards say exactly? Well, what they are rhyming aphorisms, which are actually kind of charming. But for the purposes of this episode, I think very much that they were used in a way as a kind of sly divination. They couldn't be outright divination because that would have been a bad thing, but they're in a way slightly indicating things within a divinatory direction. I'll give you an example of one of the things written on one of the cards. One of them says, "O thou who hast possessions, remain happy, and thou shalt have a pleasant life." Okay, not the most divinatory, but wait, we get some other stuff. "With the sword of happiness I shall redeem a beloved who will afterwards take my life." Huh? That's strange. What about something that says, "The Aleph rejoices and fulfills your wishes"? I mean, that could just be something that one would say, but also, I think that's pretty divinatory. Here's another one. "As for the present that rejoices, thy heart will soon open up." Thy heart will soon open up. We're talking about the future there, right? Some of you might think I'm making a bit of a mountain out of a molehill here, but I truly think that when there aren't depictions of human beings, and that we definitely do have cards where there's sayings on them, the tendency, even if it is prohibited in certain cultures, is one in which I think the need to see the future fills that void, and it just becomes obvious. Again, this goes to my thesis that these things, for the most part, when they started to drift into the West, when they eventually got to Europe, is that they already had a kind of magical nature to them. There was a magical purpose to them. Of course, yes, games were also, and gambling were a major aspect of the cards, but they also arrived with a divinatory purpose baked in. So that's where I basically like to start with, that those decks that are the link from Eastern playing cards to eventually what we would get in the West. And we have some examples, particularly there's a museum in Barcelona that has a group of uncut cardstock that very obviously would eventually, at some point, would have been cut to make a deck of cards. They're dated to about 1414. They look very similar to those Mamluk cards, to those Mamluk decks. So by 1420 or so, the evidence all around Europe is that these cards are present within society. And here's the thing, there used to be an understanding that we thought, because for the most part we just had more evidence for, particularly with something like tarot, is that they were mostly enjoyed by the aristocracy and people that were higher up within a culture or a society's hierarchy. It seems with playing cards, this wasn't exactly the case. And so it's possible we could almost say the same thing about tarot. It's harder to do so. The earliest known depiction of people playing cards is from a manuscript that was dated between 1352 and 1362, and it shows prisoners playing cards. I should be more specific. French prisoners playing cards. So that's pretty early, right? Spain, France, not too far away. Playing cards and their spread is interesting because they seem to be able to worm their way into almost any culture that wishes to engage with them. And when you start to look at the myriad of symbols and suits and ways in which these games were played, you start to notice just how versatile they are. And again, this goes to this idea that I have that there's probably something more enchanting about these things than we would like to think. Scholars of playing cards, though, have to admit that despite there being socioeconomic elements to the cards as well as contemporary tropes, perhaps the most defining feature of the spread of early playing cards were fairy tales, fables, romances, and fantasies. The more subjective aspect of human experience seemingly was one of the major ways in which these vehicles of gambling and play were able to spread as quickly as they did. Already with things like fairy tales, fables, and the word I didn't mention earlier but also plays a very large role in the stories of playing cards is mythology. But what we're looking at it in a way is a kind of whimsy and romance that is tied to these things very early on. Let us return to Spain, because that's the next stop in the history of cardamancy, at least for the things that we have some kind of evidence of. And in this case, it's not so much a deck, but a literary reference. Hey, out of curiosity, do you remember some of the games that you used to play with other kids at school? Did they sometimes have something to do with, using some kind of origami or something like that? And you'd either flip things or turn something over, and it would be about who was going to be your next boyfriend or your next girlfriend or something like that. These are seemingly, at least to me, somewhat universal adolescent games played. Would you consider that divinatory? Would that be divination? No. What if adults were doing it? Have you ever asked a tarot reader, what kind of partner is next in line for you? I'm sure you have. Well, that's certainly divination, right? We have evidence from Spain in and about the middle of the 15th century, so we're talking in and around 1450 or so, of a well-known aristocrat who, as a present for a countess in Spain, Castaneda, that he invented a card game for her. He got a deck printed of about 49 cards, according to this reference, and him actually talking about the game and how you can create the deck to use for the game. In short, the game was a way of casting lots to find the kind of person that in the future would be receptive of your love. And these were tied to suits. So for the color red, those were nuns. The color that was suit that was black, that would be widows. The color blue, that was wives. And the color green, that was maidens. What is fascinating about how he said that these were going to be designed, or at least if you were to design the deck for this game that he made for this Countess of Castaneda, that actually there would be calligraphy. You'd be writing, just like on some of those Mamluk decks, that you would have a little description there of the kind of person that you were going to fall in love with in the future by playing this game and casting these lots. So here I'd like to jump in and offer maybe a little bit of perspective for people, because some of you might have heard that and just been like, well, that's more of a game. That's not really divination. And I feel it is one of the issues that I have a lot of times with contemporary magic is that we seem to have forgotten the difference between something like telling fortunes and divining the, prophecies of the next dimension, the other world, the heavens, the blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah. I think if this kind of stuff is important to you, as it has been important to me, the way in which you should probably approach this kind of thing, or how you view cardamancy, is one that prioritizes the element of play, of playing a game. Because truly, that sort of a distinction between prophecy and playing a game in order to cast lots would have been lost to people at the inception of cardamancy. Hell, it would have been lost to people that were using cards probably as few as 100 years ago. Are you ready for thesis number 2? Here it is. The element of play and games is as crucial to the spread of cardamancy in the Western world as the divinatory consequence of doing cardamancy. In other words, the reason that these things are so playful and tactile is and probably should be viewed as being the most enchanting aspect of them. Seeing the future and playing games should be seen as being foundationally connected. So it sounds like by the early 16th century, playing cards, or at least something that we could recognize as playing cards, were pretty ubiquitous through seemingly all strata of society in Europe. It didn't take long, basically 100 years. And while we know for a fact that one of the ways in which the popularity spread was, again, because of the gambling and the gaming element of it as well, we seem to see very early on in the 16th century that divination was a part of the spread. And we have physical evidence of these through a certain thing called lot books. You see, by the early 16th century, the printing press was very certainly a thing. Gutenberg had done his job. But one must understand that objects produced through the printing press weren't done frivolously. For the most part, a lot of times the things that would be produced would be things that would be popular. If something was popular, it would be printed, and lots would be printed, and the chances of us having copies of them to this day would be because of their popularity. And one of the things that we do have that points to cartomancy, and this is where pure cartomancy comes in here, right? This is the point of no return. This is where we say, like, this is discernibly cartomancy. People have most likely been doing cardamancy for some time in Europe, but now we have evidence of it. We have these lot books, specifically from a place that we now know as Germany. These lot books, or Losbücher, one of them is called the Mainzer Losbuch. Once more, as a reminder, we are talking early 16th century in around 1505, 1515. What do one of these lot books look like? Well, for one, it will have, if one was to open up the book, on one side it would be a representation of a playing card. Like a single playing card, like, say, the page, we know them now as the Jack, the page of acorns. Acorns were a suit, particularly in Germany. At this point, playing card decks only had about 48 cards, so there'd be an image of what could potentially be on the card on one side of the page, and then across from it would be a cool little poem. And that poem would have something to do with what was going to happen in the future. We're not entirely sure how one would use the cards and then consult these lot books, but the existence of these lot books is just straight up evidence that people were using playing cards for divination. Now, what exactly do some of these poems say? Well, some of them are pretty, innocuous, pretty middle of the road, something like, enjoy and have a free life, serve God and all will be well. But some other ones are just absolute mint. Something like, you're drinking too much wine, therefore you'll have sorrows. To, you had a bad year and you've incurred many debts. You promise to pay your debts and you'll die a beggar. But my absolute favorite of all of these that I was looking through is one that goes like this. You criticized too many people and caused too much avarice. You'll lose a tooth and a thief will steal and spend your money. You're going to lose a tooth. And by the way, a thief's going to break in and take everything. There's many more. I could just go on for hours. Anyhow, I really want people to realize just how important this document is. And it's not something that I hear a lot of people talk about, particularly within the realms of cardamancy. But again, besides something like the Mamluk decks, for the Western ritual magic tradition, the Western divinatory tradition, this, between the use of cards and coming up with some kind of a fortune or a prophecy, as far as physical evidence, this is it. And in my opinion, it is a banger. Not only do you have some kind of fortune telling, something that's tied in with the act of playing a game, but there's also this wonderful wordplay that occurs. Because as I said, the meanings that I just went through are just kind of summarized version, but the poems themselves are about 8 lines. And it really just shows how wonderfully playful doing something like this would have been. For the most part, it's hard to find English translations of the poems, but I'm just going to share one. All the credit here is to a company called Experts at the Craft Table. They actually have a Kickstarter that doesn't have a ton of backers, and I would love to see this thing come to fruition of an English translation of the Manzer Losbuch, where if you were to pledge your support, you can get a deck of cards like the kind that they would have used back in about 1510 when we suspect the Manzer Losbuch would have been released. But you'll also get the book itself, the Manzer Losbuch, in a translation from German into English. Anyhow, if you have some spare coins, there'll be a link in the show notes. I think it's a really cool Kickstarter, and I think, if you throw some money towards them, the good people at the Experts at the Craft Table, you'll get yourself one of these this is the point that we can say there's definitely cardamancy occurring. I just love some of these poems too. It's so great. It's just so playful to me. And here's one of them. This is for if you bring up the card in your cardamancy reading, you bring up the Ace of Hearts or the One of Hearts. It says this: I am the banner of hearts so fair, and my loyalty to you I declare. And I'll say no more than this, my friend. You don't like to see things to the end. You think to gain friendship by your ways, but behind your words deceit always plays. I won't tell you what's bad or good when arrogance guides your every mood. Great stuff there, and a great, wonderful little translation from the folks at Experts at the Craft Table. Due to the highly refined nature of these documents that we have, like the Manzer Losbuch, we are pretty sure, at least scholars are pretty sure, that before that specifically appeared in 1510 or so, that there were lot books that were made years before that, probably as far back as 1505. Astounding document, the Manzer Losbuch, and if you're like me and you like your historic modes of fortune telling and divination, you can't go any further back than the Manzer Losbuch. Astounding stuff. All right, so where are we at now? As far as divination within the West, we have heard from Spain, we have heard from Germany, we have heard from France, or at least we see people engaging with playing cards in France. What's going on in Italy? Well, in around 1507, we have not so much physical evidence of divination, but evidence of another kind. And this is a literary reference to using cards for divination. It comes from a very interesting source. One of the fellows that is highly tied into what we're going to call the Hermetic or great occult philosophy of the Renaissance is a Italian figure by the name of Pico della Mirandola. Or dude wrote a document that written in 1486, or at least composed in 1486. It was called Oration on the Dignity of Man. Anyhow, don't have time to get into it, but our dude Giovanni Pico della Mirandola had a nephew by the name of Francesco Pico della Mirandola. Composed a work himself in 1507 called, in English, because I'm not even going to attempt to do the Latin, called On the Foreknowledge of Things. In this work, he kind of sucks up to the church in a way and says that, the people within the church that have, and saints that have knowledge of things that is going to happen in the future, they're allowed. They're allowed because they're divinely appointed. When they see the future, that is good. But as far as anybody else in Italy that's going to try and see the future, that means that they're bad. Leave it to the professionals at the totally not corrupt Roman Catholic Church to see the future, okay? Our boy Frank, he attacks some of the more long-tenured forms of gleaming the future, things like astrology and palmistry, geomancy, those kind of things. But he says something very interesting about the kinds of ways that people that are the bad people that are trying to see the future and how they go about doing this. And in one passage in this work on the foreknowledge of things goes like this: there are many kinds of lots, as in casting bones, in throwing dice, in the figures depicted in a pack of cards, and in the expectation of whatever first should arrive, in picking the longer husk, or in casting the eyes on a page. So once again, 1507, very clear evidence that by this point, and this is obviously not something that just popped up and that is new, it's because it's being written about. It would lead us to believe that this has been happening for some time, that by 1507, particularly in a place like northern Italy, cardamancy is a thing. People are doing it, and it is popular. One note, and it's something that Mary Greer points to in one of her posts, is that Francesco makes a point of saying, seeing the future in the figures on the cards, which could very well mean that what we are talking about as far as the deck is concerned is not the kind of regular playing card deck, but something more akin to what we would know as the tarot. We're not 100% positive, but it is indeed a solid speculation on Mary's part. After 1507 and leading all the way up until about 1540 or so, we don't have a ton of evidence in the variety of things like lot books that clearly show cardamancy is being used by people in every echelon of society. But what we do have are other art forms, things like paintings as well as books of poems that are clear attestations that playing cards are deeply linked with what is about to happen in the future, and that playing cards are indelibly linked in some way with prophecy and fortune. And at this point, it seems like, as far as Central Europe is concerned, it's everywhere. The map has changed greatly since the early 16th century, but from as far west as Portugal all the way to Poland, and even some indications that it's in a place like Sweden. Cardamancy as a tactic and as a vehicle for divination is an ongoing and ever-evolving tradition. I would like to think that due to the fact that the games that people would play with these cards were so unique in each and every culture and society that it found itself in that probably the way in which cardamancy was performed was also very specific and very idiosyncratic and just as unique in each and every culture that engaged in it. It's seemingly one of those things that is just we've lost so much with the passage of time, and a lot of times because these things were being done by people that didn't read or write, that unfortunately we just don't know specifically, and so we can only go to the things that we do have. And we're about to get to probably maybe one of the most fascinating things for me, because of course it comes from Venice. Those that know me know I love Venice. Well, to be specific, I love the history of Venice, the Serene Republic. What we have produced in 1540 is another oracle book that uses playing cards. Venice is one of those places that in the 16th century it was renowned for its publishing of books and texts, but also publishing things like, what we know as grimoires now and occult philosophy things, as well as chapbooks for oracles and things of that variety. And one of them is called the Oracle, known as the Garden of Thoughts. It was a collaboration between a typographer as well as a poet. For the most part, it's kind of considered the work of the typographer themselves. They went by the name of Francesco Marcolini. And this oracle, the Garden of Thoughts, is considered, along with the lot books produced in Germany, one of the best early examples of cardamancy. And I have to say, I know we'd like to think that due to cardamancy being early in its inception, that most likely the ways in which one used playing cards to gain some kind of an oracle or a prophecy would be minimalistic and simplistic. This oracle is so weird in how one tells fortunes. It's super complex. I've tried to wrap my head around how it happens. I'm at a complete loss to try to explain to you through the medium of a podcast and how one gains an oracle. I'm not even going to try. I'm going to provide a couple of links in the show notes, but it's so all over the place. It involves things like certain allegories about human beings, as well as allegories based upon their defects. It involves philosophers, known philosophers of the past, people like Socrates. There's also allegories of abstract principles. It's ludicrous, but the actual book itself, which is what we do have, is gorgeous. It's so beautiful. And once one gets past the part of how one uses the book, which, again, from I have no idea how one would do it. We need to get somebody like Sam Block on it. We need to get Polyphanes to take a look at this thing and decipher it for us, because I think it would be really cool if somebody was able to tackle this thing and make it a little bit more plain for idiots like myself to understand how to use it. But once one has a pair of cards, once one has these 2 cards laid down, that the pair of them come up with some kind of fortune or some kind of prophecy. So this book has that. It's got, once they've used it, there's these sets of 2 cards, and they're in these little boxes, kind of their own little sections, and then underneath is a little 3-line poem that says that when these 2 cards are turned up for the cardamancy, here is what is going to happen. Here is your fortune. And man, just like they did in the past, some of these they're fucking hilarious. They're so funny. One of the things that I do understand is that there's different sets of questions that one can ask, and there's 13 questions that men can ask and 13 questions that women can ask, and then there's a further 24 questions that both sexes can ask. I will say the ones for answering for women is brutal. So here's one of the outcomes from the Garden of Thoughts Oracle, Cardamancy Oracle from 1540, produced in Venice, for when a woman asks a question about love, and they do the convoluted process as to how they get these certain cards laid down, and they turn up an 8 and a page, or we would know those as a jack. The answer to one of these questions is this: poor girl, you have reached a situation in which the man you adore considers you less worthy than a chamber pot. Oof, that burn. I mean, there's still some some harsh barbs though for the gentlemen that consult this book. So one of my favorite ones is this. It says, in making money you will have strange adventures, and you will be left without a coin if you will not learn to avoid whores. Classic. Also, there's this one. If you take a woman beautiful and arrogant, I will see you in 4 days, herding goats in a pasture. Fantastic stuff. Again, I wish there was more of the information in this book. I wish we had a better translation, or a full English translation. And I wish I could actually understand how one arrives at the oracle. But I'm too dumb to do that. There's a lot of speculation as to what people actually thought about things like using dice or cards for divination through each of the strata of society in a place like Renaissance. Well, what we now know as Italy. There were city-states. Mainly Italy was made up of places like Milan or Florence or Venice, right? We know what was happening up at the very top of this society. That would be the Roman Catholic Church, and they were not a fan of using games for divination. We have several books that flat out condemn using any of these games, and those go back as far as 1556, only 6 years after the oracle that came out in Venice that I just brought up. Most of you might know what I'm going to say next, is that these things don't happen. These condemnations of certain activities don't occur unless people are doing them a lot. And condemnations only go so far. What did the people that were engaging in these card games think? Were they in accordance with the devil by trying to see their future? We're not really too sure. We have several little poems and things sprinkled throughout certain texts as well from Renaissance Italy, where people are just playing games of cards, and as they're playing, they see a certain configuration of how the cards are put down, and they immediately abstract a fortune, even though that fortune telling was not the outset. The point was initially that they're playing a game, and then suddenly somebody puts down their winning hand, and it's a queen surrounded by 5 hearts cards, and they're like, well, it looks like there's going to be a lucky lady in my future. And another card player is basically like, get back to playing the game, my dude. For the most part, I think that interplay, particularly for folks that were doing it, that interplay between game and fortune was one where it wasn't so much of a distinction. Fortunes happened, just like the games happened. And while others would say that what you're doing is in some way in league with the devil or something like that, for the most part, I don't think people really cared too much what the church had to say. This stuff was fun. The games were fun. and telling fortunes was fun. Again, my second thesis. These two things go very much hand in hand, as they should. And it seems like through the next 100 years, not a lot of evidence or things that we have that we can point to in museums comes up about how cards were used for cardamancy, but we know people were doing it. It shows up in tons of literature. It shows up in art, in paintings like the mid-17th century, The Allegory of Fortune by Lorenzo Lippi, in which there is a woman with a stack of cards in front of her, and she's got a monkey sitting to her left. And there's no way anybody at any period of time since its inception, since this painting was made, that would say that this person's just, I don't know, they're playing solitaire or a single person game. This person, this artwork is very obviously one which shows somebody in the midst of an act of cardamancy. And it's actually, from what we can tell, a fairly common, party gesture thing that cardamancers would do is that they'd have animals with them, like that of a monkey, and they'd get those animals to draw cards, or a parrot. You like the person, the cardamancer would be shuffling their playing cards, and then they'd hold the deck up to the parrot, and the parrot would take a card, and that would be the card to be putting down. And they'd do this several times. It was a trick that the part of the fortune telling cardamancy trick that was apparently popular in and around the mid-17th century. And apparently using animals for fortune telling is something that's very long tenured within European history. Really wish somebody would write a book about that. And then, I don't know, Brill will charge $500 for you to read that book, because it is such a niche topic. But it's true. People that were fortune tellers, they'd have animal assistants help you with that. Let's jump ahead about 100 years and let us jump over the water to a place that we haven't been yet, and that is, of course, jolly old England. What did they add to cardamancy? And this is also one of the coolest things ever. I believe I talked about it on an earlier podcast. I'm going to be talking about the Lenthol fortune-telling deck. From my research, and I think a couple of people would agree with me, for the most part, this is the oldest still existent European deck that we have that was created and explicitly used for telling fortunes. We believe that they were first published in and around 1665 by a Fleet Street stationer, somebody who worked with paper. Anyhow, what they produced was a deck of 52 cards, exactly the same as the kind of playing cards that we used here in the West, right? But the cards themselves are very bizarre. They have all of the suits that we're used to, things like hearts, diamonds, spades, and clubs. But at the top of the card, they have the name of either a philosopher or some notable figure from either mythology or history or just stories. Wat Tyler is there, but so is Hermes Trismegistus, Dido, Prosperina. Oh yeah, and of course Merlin's got to be there, because Merlin, right? How do I describe these cards? So the number cards, for the most part, the things that don't have people on them, things like King, Queen, Jack, they have an astrological wheel on them with the zodiac, and there's numbers put within the wheel that correspond to some of the face cards, the queens and the what we call jacks, or the pages. These figures are holding books that have numbers on them as well. How does one tell a fortune with this? Well, the kings have, all the four kings have a series of questions on them. And these are the questions that you were supposed to ask when you were using these to tell your fortune, that then directs you to those astrological spheres when one is able to, through the way that the person telling the fortune, who would probably have to be somewhat sussed in astrology as well, then references those books or those items that are on the either the queens or the jacks or the pages, which in turn leads you to the other cards here, the numeral cards in the deck, which will have the answer that you seek. And these are usually going to have little rhymes on them. Rhymes like, if you're kind, you'll fix their mind. Or a little bit saucier, there's one, you shall be wedded and then bedded. All right? These are very cool cards. And yes, from all of the research that I've done, it looks like these are the earliest existent set of cards that were used specifically for telling fortunes. And that's important. Again, this is 1665 to 1690. This kind of thing seems like it's up your alley. You like cards and you like astrology. You can buy a reproduction of this deck. Yeah, links in the show notes as always. Fair warnings again, and just because I'm an idiot, I still don't know exactly how one can use these to tell a fortune, and the the instruction manual that comes with these playing cards, and there is one, and you can read the rules. It still doesn't make sense to me. You are totally welcome to give it a shot, and when you do, please let me know how you yourself use the Lenthol fortune telling deck. All right, avid listeners, answer me this: what is the one event in European history that each and every one of you should know about, because its ramifications are incredibly important across every aspect of that continent's history? The answer, of course, is the Protestant Reformation, and of course this translates as well to magic and divination and the occult. And while a lot of it was seen as being superstitious by both sides, by the Catholics and by the Protestants brought a certain level of zeal in persecuting those who were doing some kind of prophecy or fortune telling. But that secret sauce of making something, forbidden also tends to make something a little bit more alluring. And what we see within the place that birthed Protestantism, that is Germany, in and around the 17th century, for well over 100 years, we have examples of playing cards. But on these playing cards, there seems to be writing. And for the most part, there's the figure, there's the Jack of Acorns, or there's the Seven of Hearts, and it'll be depicted there. They'll take up about 2/3 of the space on the card. But beneath that, with this writing, there would be proverbs. We all know what proverbs are, right? Something like a workman always blames his tools when something goes wrong. Short little bits of wisdom that can be distilled into like big ideas, or at least bigger ideas, kind of reduced to and boiled down to their essence. So something very short can actually mean quite a lot. Well, these cards would then have proverbs on them. And we're not sure specifically whether or not those are just put on there for fun, but a lot of people, a lot of scholars of both playing cards and cardamancy seem to think that by putting those proverbs on there, they still in some way fed into the public's thirst and the popularity of using playing cards for cardamancy. You can still, use these cards for playing games. They're still kind of okay for gambling. Depends on where you are. Sometimes some places gambling was illegal with playing cards, but for the most part, you can still use them as cards. You could also, maybe, if you feel like it, use them for finding omens, but the sayings are there, the proverbs are there, just it's how one does certain things, wink, wink. The Protestant Reformation also has its fingers in another pie, which is something that any student of European history has to know about, which is witches. To be specific, witchcraft persecution, and it was said in a couple of texts, particularly as the 16th century kind of rolls into the 17th century, that if a witch has, or somebody accused of being a witch is fond of cards and card playing, that kind of tips the scales a little bit further into them being a witch for sure. We also have artwork from as late as the middle of the 17th century of depictions of witches, and on the table or on the ground there are playing cards around other effects of things like salamanders and skulls and daggers and things of that variety. So the trope is already in place, and a lot of times, while those are artistic impressions, those are artistic license that are put into those pictures, particularly depictions of witches and witchcraft doing their things, cardamancy is there, and cardamancy is indeed viewed as being in some way some kind of baleful magic, or that they are an item that can be used in conjunction with other items in a way trying to do some kind of malevolent magic. All I'm trying to say is that at this point, playing cards, while fun and used for gambling, are also unequivocally associated with magic. What else do we have happening in the 17th century? Well, there's one other aspect of culture that actually had a huge bearing on not just things like playing cards being used for divination, but in many, many other realms, particularly intellectual realms. And that is something that is extraordinarily popular, or was extraordinarily popular in the 17th century, and is still just as popular as it has always been. And that is something that could very possibly be, as you're listening to this, within arm's reach. That's coffee. All right, so this is a big one, but again, I want to make it clear this is not an episode about the history of playing cards or a history of coffee and coffee houses. But before the 17th century, coffee was a drink. It was enjoyed in quite a few places, but mainly in what we would call the Ottoman Empire. When coffee started to make a big impact in Europe in the 17th century, there's a bit of debate as to when the very first coffee houses, places that would serve coffee exclusively as their main beverage, it was either in Livorno in Italy or in, you guessed it, that would be Venice, in either the year 1632 or 1640. Scholarly debate ensues. Anyways, for our purposes, it doesn't matter too much. But what can be said about something like coffee, and especially when something really, if you'll excuse the pun, really hot, makes an appearance in Europe, it tends to spread like wildfire. And coffee houses, although it was a bit of a slow start, they soon became insanely popular. Basically almost all over Europe, from Romania to Portugal to England. A couple of things happened that are very pertinent to the story of the history of cardamancy. The very first one being that coffee houses over time became a kind of intellectual hangout. Not all of them, but a lot of them became a place where people could go. They could get a lot of work done. They could talk with others. They became a public gathering place, and a lot of times they would be frequented by people that really wanted to make something of themselves through their art or through their philosophical prowess and things of this variety. For a period of time, particularly in England, coffee houses were in a way considered penny universities. You'd go in, you put down a penny, you'd get a newspaper, stimulating conversation, usually with somewhat educated people, or at least very literate people, and then you'd also get a cup of coffee. Who knows who might walk in? Sometimes a mucky muck like Samuel Johnson himself might make an appearance if you were lucky or some such thing. Poets, writers, actors, as well as playwrights would frequent coffee houses quite regularly. Keep that last vocation there in mind as I go forward. But what also happens is that other ways of using divination also start to get imported into this crazy new thing called coffee. I'm speaking specifically of a divination form known as tasseography. It was, we believe, started in China, and then through trade routes, particularly with certain beverages, things like tea and otherwise. This specific form of divination is reading tea leaves or reading the sediments in the bottom of a cup from whatever beverage that you're using. Something like wine, perhaps, tea, as I just mentioned, and now, since the import of coffee from the Eastern Mediterranean into Europe, tasseography was used on coffee cups and what was remaining from the sediment once one had finished a cup of coffee. Keep in mind, though, that because these were somewhat public places, things like card games would be there, and no doubt something like Cardamancy would definitely be there as well, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. The two main things that I want to draw your attention to as far as this new burst of popularity with coffee houses in Europe is, the very first one is that it would be an intellectual and an artistic hangout for a lot of people, and the second one being they became popular places for all forms of divination, at least popular forms of divination, things like tasseography or reading tea leaves or coffee grinds, but also games, people using dice and cards, but then those also get used for divination as well. So what inevitably will happen is that things will start to blend. Before we get there, though, let's talk a little bit about how people did cardamancy in and around the 17th century. Do we have any idea? Is there any kind of a written source? Turns out there is, and it has something to do with coffee houses. Well, particularly the kind of people that go to coffee houses. The source that we get for how cardamancy was probably done with a pack of playing cards is a bit of a strange one, seeing as how we get our how this was done from a play. To be specific, a play written in and around 1730 in London. Caveat time, of course, it being London, it doesn't mean that this was standardized cardamancy all over Europe. And the second thing is that we're not entirely sure if the depiction of how the cardamancy is done within this play wasn't just made up by the playwright. But we're pretty sure that this playwright knew what they were talking about, particularly as they were known to frequent coffee shops quite a bit at this time, that coffee, specifically tasseography, which at the time also would have been known as, I probably should have said this earlier, would have also have been known as tasseomancy. Well, that features in this play as well. And also, the way that the cardamancy unfolds in this play is very similar to the way in which we have documentation of how folks were doing cardamancy a few decades in the future. So it kind of lines up. Everything kind of fits in place for this being a true depiction, albeit within a play, nestled within a play, a true depiction of cardamancy from the early 18th century. All right, caveat over, let's actually talk about the play itself. It's called Jack the Giant Killer, a commie-tragical farce of one act. And the playwright is one Henry Fielding. I'm just going to say, very fascinating person, Henry Fielding. Not only a playwright, he's considered one of the founders of the traditional English novel, and he also was instrumental in a way with setting up the very first official professional police force in London, known as the Bow Street Runners. Let's talk about Jack the Giant Killer, or specifically the depiction of cardamancy within this play. Without getting overly specific, what happens is that the scene in which there's the depiction of cardamancy, it actually begins with tasseomancy, reading coffee cups and the things in the coffee cups first, and then a character wants to get a bit more specific. So what happens is that they go to a deck of cards and they start laying the cards down. But what happens to begin with is that each of the characters that are going to have their fortunes read get given a specific card. That's going to be their significator card. The play seems to make it clear that what occurs is somebody lays down rows of cards. So all the cards are basically laid down in rows, be that either 4 rows of 13 or 6 rows of 9 cards, except for the 6th or bottom row that only has 7 cards there. They find the significator cards of the people whose fortune that they're going to tell, and then they just read the playing cards around those significator cards. I'll actually read you the play itself of the person who is doing the cardamancy. And just so everybody's clear, she's laying the cards down, she's making these rows of cards, and she's using that to tell the fortunes of 4 other people in the room, right? Which I think is really cool. And it's got that wonderful play element to it. Play as in, not a play like a theater play, but play as in the thing we do when we have fun in the company of other people. Most divination these days, we're all familiar with it, usually because it's been so heavily monetized as far as people making money from it. And, that's just what happens with these kind of things. Oh my goodness, how did this soapbox appear from underneath me? Anyhow, just going to keep talking. A lot of times, but it's very transactional. Somebody needs a fortune. They go to somebody. That person tells them their fortune. Not a lot of people will just, bust out the cards in a coffee shop and start telling the fortunes of every single person around them. And you do that these days, it's pretty fucking weird. It'll turn some heads. If not, somebody might even call the police. Who knows? Anyways, I just love this whole idea that happens in this play of somebody busting out the cards, putting all these rows down, and then just giving the fortunes of several people within the room. I think it's fantastic. It's lovely. Anywho, here's the actual words from the play. Again, written 1730, Jack the Giant Killer. And so I'm going to be reading the lines of the person doing the cardamancy. She puts the cards down in rows. Not too sure what the rows are made out of, but the cards are on the table, and here's what she says. You, Lord Gormillion, are the king of clubs. Lord Thunderdale shall be the angry majesty of spades. The diamond-crowned Lord Blunderbore shall wear, and king of hearts Lord Gallivants shall assume. The knave of spades, madam, seems to threaten danger, but he lies oblique, and then the 10 of hearts between them shows he wants power to hurt you. The 8 of clubs and ace over your head denote a cheerful bowl, and birth will crown night. All will be well. These princes are surrounded with diamonds. The 8 lies at the feet of Lord Gormillion. The deuce, the 4, and the 5 are in direct line with valiant Thunderdale. The tray and 9 are at an elbow of great Blunderbore, and the 6 and 7 are just over the head of noble Gallivants. Some spades of ill aspect are mingled with them, but the hearts and clubs take off their malevolent quality. So yeah, what they're doing is they're basically, everybody gets their own card. The card signifies them as a person. This is usually done by the person doing the fortune telling, and then they just read the cards that are around them in the vicinity. And sometimes the interplay between what cards are above them or below them has great import. The further the cards are away from the significator card of the person whose fortune they are telling, it just doesn't matter. But it's the cards and the groupings of certain suits and whatnot that have some importance to the reading itself. So that's pretty cool, right? And yeah, so we didn't get this information from a book or anything like that. It might be one of the, if not the earliest depiction of English cardamancy and how people did a certain kind of cardamancy with playing cards. Not with, the cards that were designed earlier specifically for cardamancy, but just with a regular pack of playing cards like you have in your house right now. Again, just want to make it clear, we are not certain that this is the way that cardamancy was practiced all over Europe for decades or even hundreds of years. But what we do know is that a lot of cardamancy looks exactly like this in the decades that follow. And so we can kind of, in a way, again, this is speculation, but we can kind of, in a way, say that this fortune-telling, this kind of cardamancy was certainly, in a way, using huge air quotes, traditional in some sense. We're going to leave the coffee shops for a moment here. No fear, we will be returning to the Java houses in short order. So from about 1730, in which that play was written, we're going to jump ahead to the period of time from about 1760 to about 1780. And this is a very fascinating period of time for cardamancy. A lot happens in this period of time. I might get a bit confusing. I want everybody to stick with me. We can get through this together. All right. The first thing that I want to draw attention to in this period of time, for the most part, is that what we are starting to see, particularly in places like Germany and in England, we're seeing playing cards, or at least packs of cards, either between 32 and 52 cards, have not only depiction of the playing cards themselves, something like a 9 of spades, up in one of the corners of the cards, but there will be an image, some kind of a depiction of an event or a happenstance or a situation. And then under that, there will be some writing at the bottom of the card about some certain thing. In some cases, it's proverbs. In other cases, it will just be a description of the thing, the illustration that is pictured on the card itself. Now, sometimes these are used in a way for just somebody to draw inspiration or some kind of a godly message for themselves before they start their day. We don't know for sure if these cards were specifically used in a way for cardamancy, but what we can say is that the format, playing card with number and suit somewhere on card, image, illustration, writing at the bottom. This will become quite important to cartomancy as we go forward. Something else appears in and around this time, and the dates are at this point speculative, but sometime between 1750 and about 1775. I know that's a large space of time, that's about 25 years. Anyhow, what we have is a publisher, a producer of playing cards in England by the name of James Sketchley, introduced a set of cards that he called conversation cards. What these would be a pack of cards. We're not exactly sure because we don't have a full set, but they'd either be, we think, 48 to 52 cards. And what the cards would have on their front would be an image of something and then a word at the very top of the card. That's it. There's no playing card element to these cards whatsoever. Why would they be like this? Well, they were called conversation cards, but they should have really truly been called storytelling cards. Now, I love these things, and this is going to basically, in a way, be the birth of a very popular kind of cardamancy card that we know to this day as oracle cards. So yes, in and around this time, 1750 to about 1775 is, in a way, the birth period of what we know now as oracle cards. Anyways, back to these storytelling cards. What would happen with these cards? Again, what they are, just an image and then a word at the very top, is you would have a group of people with you, or you could just maybe even do it yourself if you're really bored, is that the deck gets shuffled, and then one person flips up the very first card and they begin to tell a story. And they tell a story for a certain amount of time until it shifts to somebody else who then draws a card that will have a different image and name on it. And they have to involve that in that story in a way. And it would be, it would be a game. People would just create a story, one singular story from these conversation cards until they go through the entire pack. And the ways in which the cards would play in and change the story in a way would provide amusement and wonderment for all those involved. I love this. I know some of you might be like, that's not a big deal. That's kind of silly and infantile. But I truly think that this is actually one of the most interesting things that I've come across in doing the research for this episode. The very lifeblood, if not the blueprint for oracle cards, come from a kind of get-together party storytelling game. What kind of cards could be in this deck? They're very fascinating. What you do have are very simply just the illustration that matches one-to-one the word that is at the top of the card, something like cottage, and then it's just a picture of a cottage, or something like old woman, which you just have a picture of an old woman. But for some of the other cards, things get a bit more abstract. I'll give you an example. There is a card that says heart, and on the picture of the card that says heart is an apple on a table with a dart in it and some kind of juice flowing out of the apple. Or there is a card that says deceit, and in this case, deceit is a bird cage with one bird that has very obviously opened up the door to the cage and is in the act of closing the cage on a bird that is still in the cage. Deceit. Or the card hope, which is just a picture of an anchor. Or even something that is a bit more on the nose, but still can be, in a way, abstract, which is a card that says security. And what that is a foot soldier guarding a portcullis. The question is whether these were used for cardamancy. We do not have proof that they were used with cardamancy, except in one case in which in 1775, these James Sketchley conversation cards were being sold with a book which was published earlier called The Complete Fortune Teller. So yes, and this actually takes place not in Europe, but this takes place in the Americas. To be specific, this ad is from the Virginia Gazette in 1775. An ad selling as a duo James Sketchley's conversation cards with a copy of this book, The Complete Fortune Teller. I think we can say that there's a reason that these were being sold together, and most likely that reason was that these conversation cards were being used for cardamancy. So again, that was 1775 that this advertisement appeared in Virginia. The next little bit here is going to get slightly confusing because we have to bounce around a little bit. Everything happens in different ways, and a name's going to pop up and then disappear for a bit, then pop up again. So please stick with me here. It's around 1765 that a ad appears from a card producer by the name of S. Hooper from London, saying that they are selling a deck of cards called the Oracle to be used specifically for fortune telling, cardamancy. I absolutely love what this ad has to say, particularly at the very beginning. I'll read it to you. It says, price 25 pence. The Oracle, a pack of cards, by the use of which, without the tedious consultation of the stars, or the more irksome correspondence with familiars, any person may become in an instant of time a complete fortune teller. Now, we are not too sure exactly what this deck of cards called the Oracle was. We do believe, though, that we have a pack of cards from 5 years later, from 1770, that very well could be the same because it is from the same publisher, S. Hooper. And what they are just regular playing cards, with the image of what the card is, whether it be, a 9 of diamonds. Those are taking up the vast majority of the space on the card. But what you also have at the very bottom of the card is a 4-line rhyming poem that is very obviously for fortune telling. What's interesting about these cards, or these rhymes specifically, is that for the most part it's addressed to men, but for a lot of them they have another fortune in there. Just the last 2 lines or the last sentence is specifically geared to women. I'll give you an example of some of them. So for the card that is the 2 of clubs, it has this as its little fortune. Note this deuce doth signify that thou wilt a Christian die. Women who the same do take never will their friends forsake. There you go. So you see it's got the regular male fortune there, and then it's got a little something for women there as well. But I will say, having gone through some of these cards, the woman's fortunes seem like they're just so half-assed or just not even worth a thought. I'll give you an example of another one. So this is for the 8 of diamonds. It says, hast thou got the number 8, thou wilt be a cuckold great. Females who the same do take, never will the truth forsake. Womp womp, forsake again. Ugh. Anyhow, I actually quite like these cards. They're pretty fun, and they sometimes get kind of dirty. Here's a final example here. This is the 5 of clubs. It says, by this 5, we see that thou shall join to a dirty sow. This drawn by virgins, they will have husbands, kind and gay. So yes, very definitely these cards were used specifically for a form of cardamancy. Again, we're not too sure whether the advertisement that we saw that appeared in 1765 is the same as these cards, but we do know for a fact that both the card and the advertisement were done by the same publisher, S. Hooper. Keep that name in your head. We're going to come back to it in a little bit. Now, for the most part, history episodes like this tend to have one individual whose name and deeds get intrinsically linked to the subject itself, and cardamancy is no different. And specifically due to the fact that this individual that I'm going to talk about on this history of cardamancy is literally the person who came up with the term cardamancy. And so this is an individual who is in a way the embodiment of cardamancy, and I'm including tarot in that statement as well. So we have to go to 1770. The place is France, and the title of this book, if you will forgive my outrageous accent, is Etea, au manière de se recréer avec un jeu de cartes. In English, Etea, or a way of recreating with a deck of cards. And by recreating, he basically means divining. I hope I haven't pissed off every single French person that listens to this podcast with that terrible, terrible French accent there. I don't have very many listeners in France, so yeah. Anyways, moving on. Etea, the very first word of that book, that is in fact a pseudonym of an individual by the name of Jean-Baptiste Allet. Etea is just an anadrome of his last name, Allet, Alliette, to Etea, Etteilla. Everybody got it? Cool. Moving on. This book is, again, the book which coined the term cardamancy. Well, kind of. He actually calls the thing that he's doing cartomancy, which eventually gets shortened to cardamancy. As I said, Etea is kind of the cardamancy guy. Seemingly almost all roads lead into and go forth from Etea's works. According to him and him alone, he learned how to tell fortunes from regular playing cards, as well as a different kind of deck of cards that we would now call a deck of tarot cards. He learned from 3 different cardomancers in northern Italy. And according to him, from this knowledge that he gained from these 3 cardomancers, he put it all into this book. What is in it? Well, for the most part, this book goes into how he uses a deck of 32 cards called the Piquet deck and how one can divine with them. He includes things in this book like spreads, what cards on certain position on the table. I think the word he uses is disposition. Anyhow, a certain card here means a certain thing when it's next to this kind of card, that kind of stuff. He has specific meanings for each of the 32 cards of the Piquet deck. And he also includes a meaning for that card if it is reversed or if it's upside down. It means something different. This book is basically the book that changes everything. And I don't want to make too fine a point of it, but its influence is massive. He had a day job before he published this book, and after this book came out, and after it became republished several times, he basically just became a guy that would teach cardamancy and his system to people for a fee, and that's how he became very well known, as well as, from what we are told, somewhat affluent as a consequence. I fear, though, that we have to step away from Etea for the remainder of this episode, mainly due to the fact that his influences after this publication of his first book tends to lean more so into the tarot category, and I've done quite a bit on Etea in that History of Tarot episode. All I can say is that when his first book came out, what we saw was an explosion across all of Europe, specifically continental Europe, of playing cards specifically using the name Etea and designed for the most part to be utilized with that book. And there would be Etea decks, not just Etea tarot-ish decks, but Piquet decks produced for well over 100 years after his death. At some point, I would love to do an episode on Etea. We don't have a ton of information about him, but fascinating fellow. He most likely, if I'm to speculate, I think he just basically came up with most of the stuff off the top of his head. I think he was interested in cardamancy, and he'd probably seen it around, right? But I think the meanings both regular and reverse. And most likely reverses were a thing that were around also with those proverb cards, right? The ones that are usually seen to be right way up, and when somebody's doing something and they're not that way, that a different meaning can come from those cards. I don't think he created reverses. He's just kind of one of the first people to actually talk about it. If not, I believe he is the first person to talk about them. But my opinion, I think he just created it all. And I think that's still pretty cool. Like, he put his stamp on it and it became his. And in a way, there's no other person that can claim to be the king of cardamancy, I'd say, than Jean-Baptiste Allen. After this first book, he would go on to produce quite a lot of publications. He eventually passed away in 1790. We're not sure how he died, but he did die young. He was only 53. Allow us now to head back to England, cross that channel, if you will, and talk about that publisher once again, S. Hooper. What is he getting up to, and what did he get up to in the 10 years after he produced those oracle cards that I talked about, that oracle deck, as it was advertised in 1765? Well, he also puts out a set of, I believe, 56 conversational cards, not unlike that of James Sketchley, who had done so earlier. We're in the realm of speculation here, but due to Hooper's earlier penchant for producing those oracle cards, we suspect that this set of conversational cards that they produced was most likely leaning more so into the category of cardamancy than conversational cards. The kinds of cards are very similar to that of Sketchley's deck, but the illustrations themselves seem to be a bit more detailed. Some of them still have that strange abstract quality to them, and much of the themes are certainly of a classical nature. Tarot historian and creator of decks of fortune-telling cards or divinatory cards, Robert Place, has a fantastic write-up about this deck produced by S. Hooper specifically. Check it out. It is going to be in the show notes. But yes, what I'm trying to say with this segment here is that things are changing. Cards that are to be produced for one thing, new sets of cards, right, with just images and text on them are being produced for something specifically, but they are most likely being used for cardamancy. So they're being produced for one thing, but definitely being used for other things. And the fact that we have card producers that are known for producing cards for fortune telling are also getting in on the conversational card game, and with these kind of cards that are more image based than anything, it's pretty safe to say that this time period from about 1765 to 1777 is the birth decade of oracle decks. So while Atea may very well be the king of cardamancy, I would be negligent in my duties as an amateur historian of magic and the occult if I did not bring up the queen of cardamancy, and that is none other than Marie-Anne Lenormand. What can I say about Marie Lenormand? She seemed to be quite a character, and one of the reasons that she is equated so strongly with cardamancy, I believe, is that she was alive for an extremely tumultuous and important period in Western history. That would be the French Revolution, as well as the reign of the tyrant and dictator and military genius Napoleon Bonaparte. With such fertile ground, you will find the tree of myth that has grown up from Marie-Anne Lenormand to be just staggering. There are so many stories, and most of them were shared and written well after her death. We know very little about her, and what we do have as far as her biographical details are concerned, the stuff that she herself shared, those are very definitely, for the most part, probably all fiction. She said that she was taught cardamancy by her words, gypsies, when she was 14 years old. These people that trained her saw that she had some kind of an ability to see the future and gave her a pack of cards and showed her how to use them. Most likely this wasn't the case at all. We have very little information as to the early life as well as the rise to cardamancy stardom of this enigmatic figure. We know that she was orphaned at a very young age, raised in a convent in a place outside of Paris. Eventually she made her way to Paris. She was there for the storming of the Bastille in 1789. The rest is guesswork. She somehow was able to become the most influential cardamantic card reader for this period of time in this country. And while all we have are anecdotes and hearsay, apparently she had given readings to such people as Marat, Robespierre, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and certainly her most famous client, and allegedly a client that would see Marie over and over and over again, the lover of Napoleon Bonaparte, Josephine. As far as her cardamancy goes, we don't have a ton of information. We have stories shared by several notable figures after her death that explain what happened when they went for cardamantic readings with this person. It sounds like this person liked to keep a lot of spooky stuff in the room in which they were doing their readings, and it was kind of like a sensory overload when you would walk into her room. And more than that, her card readings seemed to be one of those things where she'd have several decks of different kinds of cards. One very definitely a set of cards that was modeled after Etea's way of reading cards. And according to one of her clients, she would not just use one deck in her reading. She would be pulling cards from different decks. It was kind of just like she was giving everybody the razzle dazzle and just really exuberant in her readings. She must have been very good in a way that must be infuriating to us because we seemingly have no idea how she did her cardamancy. All we know is that she was active as a cardamancer, indeed the premier cardamancer in France, because she was at it for more than 40 years. And when she died, she had well over 500,000 francs, which is quite a sizable amount of money at that period of time. She didn't have any children. I believe all of her money went to her nephew, who hated the fact that she was involved in some way with the occult, and so had every aspect of her life, including her cards, her work, and all of the items in her residence burned, and he just took the money. So yeah, that happened. Marie was, more than anything, a larger-than-life figure, and truly one of those people that, while Etea gets a lot of the technical credit as well as the publishing credit for technique involved in doing cardamancy, again, my speculation is that it was something he entirely made up. It was the bravado and the mythology around Lenormand that made her as much of a notable figure within the world of cardamancy for the period of time in which she was alive to, well, the couple hundred years after she was dead. Her last name, Lenormand, would be synonymous with fortune-telling cards from as few as 2 years after her death all the way to today. Marie is one of those people that I wish we had more information about, particularly because they just seemed so freaking cool. I bet we would have got along like a house on fire, but more than anything, again, all she adds to this story is her reputation and a heaping load of very interesting mythology to the, at this point, increasingly popular act of using cards to tell fortunes and for divination. Marie Lenormand passed away in 1843. She is buried in probably the most famous graveyard in the entire Western world, Père Lachaise, in Paris, obviously. The name Lenormand is going to hang over the probably next half an hour of this episode because, again, the reputation of this cardamancer was one that, for a period of time, was pretty much synonymous with cardamancy. Cardamancy, Lenormand, cardamancy. How about some more coffee? All right. Let's go back to coffee grounds and tasseography. You see, one of the main aspects of reading coffee grounds, at least from what we are told from certain texts from the period of time in which it was very popular, is that apparently the grounds that were remaining at the bottom of a freshly consumed cup of coffee form images, they form symbols, and it is up to the person doing the tasseomancy or the tasseography to interpret those symbols. These skills would be taught over time to those who want to learn it, and it became fun, and it would spread from one coffee house to the next coffee house. And so what started to happen is that certain symbols, certain kind of themes would come up again and again, to the point that in some way they become standardized in some form of a tradition. And this would, of course, evolve over time. The interpretation of the symbol or the image that one sees in the coffee grounds would certainly pertain to the question being asked, but the symbols, the images would seemingly be the same. Some of you might be asking, well then, what are some of these images, or what are some of these symbols that one can see in these remaining coffee grinds at the bottom of a coffee cup? Well, they're things like the sun, or a ring, or a dog, a tree, a birch rod, or a whip. Even something as ubiquitous as a cross. All right, where is all this taking us? Well, what we have is in Vienna in 1794, a new set of cards appeared, probably specifically for fortune telling and very definitely related to tasseography, particularly in the images that tasseography would elicit put down and on these cards. We learn about this deck of cards from a book published in England called The Diversions of the Court of Vienna, in which the mystery of fortune-telling is unraveled by the means of 32 emblematic cards with a book of suitable directions. They really had amazingly long titles back in the day, and while that might seem tiresome to us now because most book titles are like 2 or 3 words, oh man, the the 18th and 19th century book titles are just, I love them so much. Anyhow, pray tell, what were these suitable directions? Fortune-tellings from the grounds of coffee cups, fortune-telling by laying out cards, and the new imperial game of numbers. That last one we're not going to pay too much attention to, but let's talk about the first two, right? Reading about coffee grounds and then cards. So what we actually have in this English book, produced in 1796, is an allusion to a pack of cards that came from Vienna 2 years earlier in 1794. It talks about a deck of 32 cards, wherein the images that are on the cards, as well as the divinatory meaning of the image itself underneath the image, are derived explicitly from reading coffee grinds, at least with some of the images that would have been popular in and around Austria at this period of time. What are some of these images? Things like clover, anchor, snake, coffin, moon, sun, clouds, heart, mouse, rider, fish, and on and on. How about some of the words or the divinations that are tied to these cards? I'll use an example. One of the images is of a tree, and the little divination that goes below it is, "Never regret labor or pains a good work. It is its own reward. Be this your consolation." My absolute favorite is the translation of the card, the rider, of a man riding a horse, and he's holding a riding crop. It says this underneath: "Despair not of men's goodness, for you shall have an unexpected proof of it. You may expect news and restitution of that which you thought lost." This deck is eminently fascinating and actually incredibly important. Some of you might very well know where this eventually will lead us to vis-a-vis a variety of cartomantic deck. Alas, we do not have an actual Viennese version of this deck, just the English translation and reproduction in this book produced in English 2 years after these supposed cards were very popular. Fortune telling and games go hand in hand, as I have mentioned, as well as different forms of divination are always very closely related. And so tasseography and cardamancy are just two peas in the same pod. They share things. There's kind of this cross-pollination that occurs between the two. Divination and fortune telling have always been, in a way, very syncretic in how it gets its influences. But all in all, I think the one thing that overrides every single aspect of fortune telling and divination is this idea of having fun with it. And one of the best ways of having fun with anything is creating a game. So our next stop on this journey is a game, a German game specifically called Das Spiel der Hoffnung, or the Game of Hope. In 1798 to 1799, a fellow by the name of Johann Caspar Hechtel created, in a way, a kind of portable board game by using cards as the board itself. 6 rows of 6 to make a square containing 36 cards that make up this game. In short, it is a kind of race game, not unlike that of snakes and ladders. So what happens once all these cards are laid down, you have 2 dice and you roll the dice. Whatever number you get starts you along your journey to move on the cards themselves. Some cards are good and allow you to go forward more spaces. Some cards are bad and have you drop back even further. It sounds like a pretty fun game. Now, one might ask, what does this have to do with cardamancy? Well, the images on these 36 cards of this game called the Game of Hope, 30 of them are exactly the same as the images from that deck of cards that I just talked about. Those Viennese fortune-telling cards based off of some of the images that one would get from reading coffee grinds. Now, no one has any idea why Johann used these images specifically. Most likely because they were probably pretty familiar to folks not just in Austria, but in what is now Germany. And so it would have been already familiar to everybody at the time, or they would have just known about it. It also seems like Johann wanted to basically make these cards as utilitarian as possible, because he seems to have ditched the little divinatory words at the bottom of those Viennese cards and instead added both a version of German playing cards as well as French playing cards in the top left and top right corners, respectively. And the reason for this is mainly just because you could use these cards to just play regular card games if you wanted to. So, you know, if you're at a party and you're like, let's play the Game of Hope, and they're like, nah, that's boring. Well, you'd be like, well, we can also play just this regular card game. Why not? Right? But wait, that's not all. Johann also included in the little booklet that he produced with this set of 36 cards instruction on how to use the Game of Hope for cardamancy. So you get here at the party, let's play the Game of Hope. Nah, boring. All right, let's play a card game. Does anyone want to play a card game with these cards? Nah, boring. Okay, well, does anyone want their fortune read? Yay! Right? Anyways, these are just incredibly fascinating cards. These Game of Hope cards, they're a bit busy. There's a lot on them. And as far as the Game of Hope is concerned, yeah, it's snakes and ladders with cards. I don't understand sometimes why the image makes you move backwards or forwards. It seems pretty arbitrary, but anyhow, all of it is quite fascinating and continuously points us back to this thesis that play and games are integral to cardamancy. They very much might just be the most important element to cardamancy. So there you have it, the game of hope, and apparently it was popular enough that it just kind of stuck around for quite some time. Johann made a little bit of cash from it, and it was just one of those games that, just kind of stuck around in the background. It wasn't the most popular game at the time, but it was popular enough that it just kind of was always around. Kind of like the game Othello. You guys remember Othello? I know some of you do. It's all right. Not great, not terrible. It's just Othello. Anyways, moving on. So that's 1798, 1799. And this closes out the 18th century, and we head into the 19th century. The first 30 years of the 19th century, so we're talking from 1800 to about 1830. For the most part, we don't have a lot of information with this period of time. We're just kind of assuming that playing cards and conversation cards are being used for cardamancy for the most part. The first half of the 19th century is dominated with the influence of Marie-Anne Lenormand. One of the nicknames that was given to Marie-Anne Lenormand, she was known as the Sibyl of Paris. For those of you that don't know what a Sibyl is, it's complex, but in short, Sibyls were oracles or prophetesses in ancient Greece. And due to the refound, rekindled love of the classical world that occurred in places like Central Europe, they would apply these old concepts and these old names and even old mythology onto anything that they could at the time. So Marie-Anne Lenormand became the Sibyl of Paris, meaning that she was like the oracle or the prophetess of Paris. The reason I'm bringing this up is that the idea of sibyls was then, in a way, grafted onto fortune-telling and divination of any kind. In 1827, a new deck of fortune-telling cards, or cardamancy, arose, and it was called La Sibylle des Salons, or the parlor sibyl. And thus we have the birth of what are known as sibyl decks. What did the very first one of these look like? So it's a bit of a combination of a bunch of stuff. So for the most part, you have a card with a little vignette, a little illustration there. Then underneath that, you have a little oracle as to what the card means, usually one or two words. It's very slight. Sibyl cards they're very brief with their wordage. And then because the game of hope and all of these other cards, including cards earlier from Germany and in Vienna, you have the playing cards. In this case, not 32, not 36, the standard 52 playing cards. And that the little card within the card that would be put up in one of the top corners, either the left or the right corner. The very first Sibylle de Salon was produced by and signed by somebody by the name of Manson, but it is very clear that they were not designed by this person. They were most likely designed by J.J. Granville, who was actually a famous artist at the time. He was highly prolific, probably the most famous caricature artist of his time. And that name, J.J. Granville, is actually a pseudonym. His real name is Jean-Ingles Isidore Gerard. The illustrations are, they're like caricature artists of the late 18th century, early 19th century, and they're little vignettes of what would have been very familiar for folks living in Paris at the time. It's an interesting period of time for Paris, particularly because they kind of got thrust into what we now know as the Industrial Revolution. So it's fun and interesting in that way. By 1827, there's obviously a lot of cardamancy going around, and there's a lot of different kind of decks and a lot of different kinds of playing cards that have images on them and things of this variety. But the reason that I'm talking about the Sibylle de Salon deck is that it has one of these things that I don't really see other decks doing for the most part. And one of the things that has made these Sibyl cards a fascinating and interesting deck unto itself is that, as I said, the cards have vignettes, but they also have suits on them, right? They have the regular 52 playing cards on them. But it seems like the suits are actually geared specifically to a certain kind of concept. And this was done right at the outset. So the very first Cible de Salon decks that we see all seem to have this. I'll give you an example. So the suit of diamonds, for the most part, the vignettes that are on them seem to be in some way about evoking expression. Things like joy and friendship and reconciliation. The suit of clubs evokes the hazards and mundane joys of everyday life out in the public, not behind closed doors. It's about public perceptions for the most part. The hearts cards, very obviously, are about love and romance and family, friendship, as well as emotions. And finally, spades are, spades. Dread, conflict, illness, and of course, death. The Cible de Salon and its association with the name Cible and with Marie-Anne Lenormand, who, again, didn't die until 1843. This first Cible de Salon deck was produced in 1827. Since it was first published, Cible de Salon cards have never been out of vogue, but they're kind of one of those decks that really are seemingly always off the radar, particularly here in North America. Not too many people know about Cible decks. And if this is all brand new to you, I would urge you to try and find yourself a Cible de Salon cards. Now, they don't have the kind of, the highfalutin, esoteric, occult stuff that a lot of people come to cardamancy for, but I think that they are just very special cards, and some of the readings that can be gleaned from Cible de Salon decks or Cible cards are absolutely fantastic, well worth looking into. And one of the reasons that these Cible de Salon cards kind of, in a way, went off of the radar of popularity is due to another different kind of cardamancy deck, one which is very popular now, and it seems to be increasing in popularity with every single decade. And it is one, again, wherein the Cible of Paris, Marie-Anne Lenormand, had a hand in its popularity, at least in name alone, because this deck takes its name directly from her. You see, Marie-Anne Lenormand passed away in 1843, as I said, and due to her popularity and with her demise being, a thing keeping her reputation on everybody's lips at the time, it's true. Death, for some reason, makes people popular again. If you go to Wikipedia, you go to the homepage there, you look at the most read articles that week, 90% of the time, it has to do with people who have passed away. Anyhow, Marie-Anne Lenormand dies, and right after she dies, like in the months after she is dead, her name is being put on cardamancy decks. Decks that she probably had never used or would have no intention of using were she still alive. In France, there was a 52-card Grand Jeu Lenormand, but it was 3 years after her death where something miraculous happened, and something which is with us still to this day. So we're going to Koblenz, Germany, where a deck was produced of 36 cards, which is pretty standard for a German deck of playing cards. But these cards also did that thing where there is a little image, a small little thing depicted on the card itself. No words whatsoever on these cards, but they also kept at the very top in the center of the card. So the card within the card is still there from the regular German 36 playing card deck. Now, one could very well ask, well, what are these images? What are the symbols that are to be found on this 36 card deck? Here's where things get pretty interesting. The images on these cards are basically pretty much almost exactly the same images on the cards that were sold as the Game of Hope. And by proxy, going all the way back to those earlier Viennese coffee ground reading playing card symbols. This first deck, produced in 1846 in Germany, came with a little insert, one which would let you know that these cards were, for the most part, made exclusively for fortune-telling and cardamancy. The little insert existed for folks to be able to find out what the symbols on the cards mean as far as fortune-telling is concerned. And at the very bottom, it was signed by Philip, heir to Madame Lenormand. This Philip person isn't a real person. They're just fictitious. There was no heir to Marie Lenormand. It was very evoking her name on this little insert and on these cards is just a way of taking advantage of the notoriety and the reputation of the Sibyl of London, Marie Anne Lenormand. And it seemed to work because these cards became very popular. And then we find reproductions of this exact deck in places like Belgium, very close to Germany, then eventually Sweden, France, and eventually the United States. This style of deck, or this format, became, because of that insert on the original pack of cards, became known as the Petit Lenormand. In English, the Little Lenormand, but we know them now as Lenormand cards. And they are, for the most part, one of the most popular forms of cardamancy since they were published in the middle of the 19th century. I love them. I think they are fantastic. What are some of the images that you will find on these Lenormand cards? Some of them are very plain, very boring. Things like a lady, the moon, the sun. The moon and the sun aren't boring. But just as an image compared to some of the other things on these cards, they kind of are. There's things like a dog, a child, birds, that kind of stuff. But you get more. There's a coffin. There is a scythe. There is an anchor, a tower, a mountain, a whip, and on and on and on. As far as we know, and should be fairly obvious, Marie Lenormand didn't use these kind of cards. For the most part, she would use Athéa's cards as well as the standard French piquet cards, so that would be 32 cards. And she also used a German playing deck that consisted of 36 cards, just like the Lenormand cards, but that's about as close as Lenormand actually got to Lenormand decks. What wonders what she would have thought of them, these decks of cards that bear her name. She probably would have liked them. She was a strange person. I probably should have mentioned it earlier. Man, she did everything in her reading. She was all over the place. She also knew numerology and palmistry. She would read egg whites, coffee grounds. For some people, they said that she did a form of scrying, and at one point, some kind of magic circle on the ground, so perhaps some kind of negromancy. She was very, I think the kids say, extra in how she did her cardamancy and divination and fortune telling. She just seemed to throw a whole bunch of stuff at the wall, and whatever stuck. Anyhow, the Lenormand deck, for the most part, has, since its inception from the very beginning, been one that uses a form of reading cards that would have been familiar to folks in those coffee houses. And what you do is you just lay down all of the cards. This is known as a grand tableau, and certain cards signify certain things, and their proximity to other cards is basically how you do somebody's fortune, or even a whole party's fortune. The grand tableau is great for doing not just one person's fortune, but perhaps several people's fortunes. There are many different ways to do grand tableaus, and for sure the way that they have been done for the most part has evolved. Some people prefer to go old school. Some people prefer to do newer versions of the grand tableau. There's no rules. I think that the Lenormand deck is a fantastic deck for cardamancy, if not one of the best. Some part of me really wants to tell people that they should learn to tell fortunes via cards first with a regular deck of playing cards, and then you get to graduate to using Lenormand cards, and then from Lenormand cards, then you should be able to go to tarot cards. But as we all know, and myself included in this, most people go straight to tarot cards. But I think there's something to be said for very simple images, and the simplest that you get are indeed with playing cards. And then, yes, just having very simplistic images or symbols like that on Lenormand cards really allows you to flex your cardamantic fortune-telling skills before, yes, you get to the wonderful stuff that's depicted on tarot cards. Again, just my depictions, and while I just maybe sounded like I repeated myself, if you have yet to try cardamancy, that is Doug's prescription. Start with playing cards. Actually, you know what? I kind of take it back. Hey, everybody listening, if you're unfamiliar with cardamancy, you want to give it a shot for the first time, get yourself an edition of French tarot cards. They're called Jeux de Tarot. They're usually sold by a company called Ducal. 78 cards, the suits that you know, spades, clubs, hearts, diamonds, that kind of stuff. They also have little vignettes on some of the cards. Wonderful. Probably the best way to start learning cardamancy. If you can master those cards, you can master absolutely everything. And it ticks all the cartomantic boxes, if you will. Anyhow, back to Lenormand cards. Le petit Lenormand were, as I said, popular, spread from Germany to all over continental Europe. They made their way to America, where there would be instruction booklets in English and German, although sometimes they wouldn't go by the name Petit Lenormand. I believe one of the names it went by as Madame Moreau's fortune-telling cards, but it was just the Petit Lenormand. They were very, very popular, and then they just weren't for a period of time. They just stopped being popular. The tarot kind of took over all over the Western world in the late 19th century. And since the early 2000s, when people started to rediscover these decks of cardamancy, with a lot of publishers of esoteric books releasing their own Lenormand decks, as well as books on how to use Lenormand cards, the last 25 years have seen Lenormand cards become very popular. It's the hipster tarot cards, if you will. And guilty. I love them. I think they are great. One of my favorite decks that I use for cardamancy, one that I probably use more than most tarot decks, besides a Marseille deck, is called the Maybe Lenormand, produced by Ryan Edward, because it uses 52 cards, like a standard deck of playing cards. So it has the original, the original 36 with the original images and the original playing card number in the very top at the center, but then with the remaining 16 cards to make 36 to 52. No fool Ryan, he did not just pick arbitrary vignettes or images to put at the bottom of the cards. He knows what he's talking about. He knows the history of cardamancy. And so he chose images from similar kinds of cardamantic decks that popped up after the death of Marie-Anne Lenormand. Things like the Lion or Bacchus, the Roman god, dueling swords, lightning. Anyways, the Maybe Lenormand is, in my opinion, just a fantastic Lenormand deck. But I would still urge people to, if they do get the Maybe Lenormand, stick with the original 36 cards, and then you can add the other ones once you kind of get the hang of those. Just, for tradition's sake, if you will. Some part of me is very traditional about this stuff. I can't help myself. Prediction time, fortune-telling time. I think that Lenormand cards will continue to be very popular, and I see their popularity rising. Will they be as popular as tarot cards? Nope. Will they be as popular as oracle cards? Nope. But they will be there as a sporting third, I believe. I know I've been saying this a lot about basically every deck that I've talked about, but fascinating deck of cardamantic cards. The lineage is so interesting to me, from coffee shops to tassiography to coffee grind reading to symbols within those coffee grinds to cards that have those symbols to a game very much like Snakes and Ladders, one that one would play with dice, to eventually this deck of cards that just happened somewhat organically, and they became a thing that we use and have been using since 1846. Very interesting lineage. Now, could Lenormand cards be considered oracle cards? Yeah, kind of. I don't know. I kind of have them a little separate because they still have the playing card aspect there. And those actually read into readings when I use the Lenormand cards. A lot of people just ignore those playing cards. You can't do that. I think they're as important an element to the cardamancy as the symbol beneath it. Anyhow, if you are already familiar with tarot cards, you know all about the tarot stuff, and perhaps you knew about Lenormand cards, but you haven't really taken the plunge, that would be a fun time. Give it a shot. They're wonderful. Our next stop is 1863. The place, at least one of my ancestral homelands. We're going to be talking about Scotland. The source for this information is a bit different. It comes from what is called Chambers' Book of Days. Let's talk about the author first, Robert Chambers. He was a geologist, a publisher, one of the early people to adopt the theory of evolution. And in 1864, he published what is known as the Chambers' Book of Days. Now, how can one explain what this thing is? You know what, I'm just going to give the actual full title of this. It was the Chambers' Book of Days, a miscellany of popular antiquities in connection with the calendar, including anecdote, biography, and history, curiosities of literature, and oddities of human life and character. Basically, it was a book with a lot of fascinating and interesting shit in it. The best comparison that I can make, and forgive me everybody for this, but I'm going to do it anyways, because if you know, you know. Back in the mid-90s to maybe the early 2000s, what was very popular for that period of time were called toilet books. Well, maybe that wasn't the actual name. They were bathroom readers. There was books that you could buy, and most major bookstores, remember those? Major bookstores. Anyways, most major bookstores carried them. They sold so many of them. The most popular, I think, or at least the one that I had in at the bathroom in the home that I grew up in, was called Uncle John's Bathroom Reader. There were so many volumes of it. They were popular because they were just crammed full of a lot of information that you could read for the short duration that it took you to relieve yourself, basically. The information would be, usually pretty nifty. It was trivia, right? You'd come out of the bathroom and you'd be like, oh, by the way, did you know that there is a variety of shrimp called the mantis shrimp that has perhaps the most developed eyes in the animal kingdom, and aquariums stopped putting them in aquariums because they pack a punch with their front claws that can actually crack glass. Did you know this? And every person you'd say this to would be highly disinterested. Anyways, these books, again, very popular just because, there's lots of fun-ish information in them. Well, that's what Chambers' Book of Days was. And as you could glean from the title, it was organized by dates on the Gregorian calendar. So yes, he would have information about every single day of the year. It'd be one of those things, you'd have this Chambers' Book of Days, and then whatever day it was, you'd open it up and you'd read a little interesting information about that day. Well, on February 21st, what does Robert have in there? There's a small section called The Folklore of Playing Cards. What's fascinating about this section is that Chambers got this information from experience. He remembers how his family members would use playing cards for telling fortunes. And at one point when he was a child, he caught an illness that he did recover from, but he was somewhat bedridden for quite some time. And it was during this illness that he learned cardamancy. So he decided for this entry on February 21st to share the information of cardamancy as he knew it. It's a fascinating little article. It's kind of like one of those bathroom readers where you could learn about a certain form of cardamancy or using playing cards and how to divine a fortune from that. And it's also got some personal opinions from Robert as to the kind of people that do cardamancy for the most part. At one point he says, A few words must be said on the professional fortune tellers that they are, generally speaking, willful imposters. Zing. He also actually literally goes through every single card in a 52 pack of playing cards and tells you exactly what the meaning of those cards are. So something like the Eight of Diamonds is a happy, prudent marriage, though rather late in life. Something like the King of Spades represents an individual. Most of the court cards are people, right? Which is something that was fairly traditional from about the middle of the 18th century onward. A lot of times if you're using playing cards, when a court card comes up, a king, a queen, a jack, or knave, they represent a person, right? So like a king of spades is a man of very dark complexion, ambitious and unscrupulous. Chambers also talks about the mode in which how one goes about telling the fortune, or something like we'd all recognize as a spread. He says this: the general mode of manipulating the cards when fortune telling is very simple. The person who is desirous to know the future, after shuffling the cards, cuts the pack into 3 parts, lays the cards out one by one, faced upwards upon the table, sometimes in a circular form, but oftener in rows consisting of 9 cards in each row. 9 is the mystical number. Every 9 consecutive cards form a separate combination complete in itself, yet, like a word in a sentence, no more than a fractional part of the grand scroll of fate. I love that. Grand scroll of fate. Again, every card, something like the octaves in music, is in rapport with the 9th card from it, and these 9th cards form other complete combination of 9s, yet parts of the general whole. The 9 of hearts is termed the wish card. After the general fortune has been told, a separate and different manipulation is performed to learn if the prior into futurity will obtain a particular wish. And from the position of the wish card in the pack, the required answer is deducted. Very fascinating, very unique way of performing cardamancy. If you love cardamancy, hey, why don't you give this Robert Chambers cardamancy a little bit of a try? Now, how indicative would this be of the kind of cardamancy via playing cards at the middle of the 19th century? Is this section that Robert put in his book? We don't really know, but for the most part, in the way in which the information is relayed, it seems to be like he's not just, making it up for the sake of making it up. It sounds like he really, really cared about getting the proper information, not just for this section, but for every single section in his book, The Book of Days. In fact, it's one of those things where he put so much effort into this work that it probably killed him. Yeah, he died a couple of years after it came out, and yeah, it was apparently a pretty taxing process to gather all of this information and then squeeze it all into one book. I wonder how Uncle John did with his books. And in the spirit of, providing a little tidbit of interesting trivia, both him and his brother were born with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. From the middle of the 19th century all the way to the early 20th century, what you have are just a ton of variations of different kinds of fortune-telling cards, things that look a lot like those Sybil decks that I mentioned earlier. There'd be slight variations on them, and they'd be released as Sybil decks themselves. There's a lineage of fortune-telling cards called Kipper fortune-telling cards as well. In North America, a lot of drugstores and pharmacies would have packs of cards that would have names like hoodoo fortune cards and things of that kind. And for the most part, they were either just like Lenormand cards or variations on Sybil cards. Extremely popular in places like New Orleans and the West Indies were all of the many different varieties of cards based on Atea's work. By the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, cardamancy was as popular as it had ever been all around the Western world. Many publishing houses would release some variation of an already established cardamancy format, and sometimes they were successful and they would continue publishing them, and sometimes they would not be successful and they would be scrapped. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that once the release of the Waite Smith deck occurred in 1909, although it took some time for it to become as popular as it is now, due to the work of Eliphas Levi and his very unique move in mapping tarot cards to the Kircher Kabbalistic Tree of Life. As we all know, tarot would eventually become certainly the most popular format of cardamancy, seemingly increasing with every decade of the 20th century. What does happen with any kind of popular format, however, is that when one form becomes more popular than any of the other forms, a certain stagnation occurs, not just with the most popular one, but with all of them. Cardamancy deck formats tended to relegate themselves into their own kind of groups. The Petit Lenormand stayed Lenormand. Tarot cards stayed tarot cards. People began to expect certain things from certain kinds of cards, and any kind of deviation outside of the norm, for the most part, didn't happen as it probably should have. That's kind of where we are situated now. People like what they like. They like the familiarity of what certain kinds of cardamancy decks have to offer. Lenormand cards, for the most part, are staying at 36 cards. Tarot cards, for the most part, usually follow a format either that of a Marseille French tarot deck or Arthur Edward Waite's format. While the popularity of all of these decks of cardamancy cards that we have available to us now is such a gift, and there really are some truly, absolutely stunningly beautiful decks of cards for using cardamancy. For the most part, innovation outside of the norm and outside of what the consumer expects from these kind of cards has been, in my opinion, severely lacking. That doesn't mean it's going to stay like this forever, but it is very hard to find unique and idiosyncratic decks for cardamancy. I think now is the time where some new formats should probably start to emerge. Either that or people start to deviate from the traditional and surge forward with new ways in which one can perform cardamancy. The field is as open as it can be. And in my personal opinion, we have had a shot across cardamancy's bow that people should truly take as a cue to try something different. And it comes from something both old and new at the same time. You see, over the last 3 years, I have become utterly fascinated by a tarot deck, but to be more specific, by a cardamancy deck in the truest sense of the word, that was created, one of the absolute titans of Western magic, a member of the Fool's Gallery. In 1906, an up-and-coming artist as well as ritual magician created for himself a tarot deck of a highly experimental nature. This deck was lost to time until, in 2013, it was discovered in the collections of the Magical Circle Museum, a society of like-minded magicians based out of London. Eventually, this deck would make its way to the publishers, also based out of London, Strange Attractor, who released a book, Lost Envoy, which showed the uniqueness and the brilliance of this tarot deck, but also how this deck fit in to the life of its creator. I am, of course, talking about the tarot deck created by the one and only Austin Osman Spare. Lucky for us, this publishing company, Strange Attractor, put out a Kickstarter for those people like me that were very fascinated by this tarot deck to be able to get a reproduction of it, which I was able to receive in 2023. And I have to say, it's one thing to read about a tarot deck in a book, but it is another thing entirely to hold it in your hands and to play with it. What can I say about this deck? I'm going to try to not make this too long. I think it is astoundingly brilliant. Its genius lies in its simplicity and with the kind of carefree attitude of somebody who is just trying to experiment with things, just try something new. If you're unfamiliar with the deck, it has all of the hallmarks of a tarot deck. You know, it's got the major arcana, it's got the minor arcana, but it has ditched the tarot suits, you know, swords, wands, discs, cups, that kind of thing, and actually gone back to playing card suits. Spades, clubs, diamonds, hearts. All of the cards are bidirectional, meaning that if you turn it and it's upside down, there is a reading that is specific for that card being upside down or reverse, as the terminology is. The numbered cards, for the most part, take their cardomantic meanings from an as yet unidentified source. The cards themselves are meant to be put in a row when one does a fortune-telling reading, or at least this is how Austin probably wanted it to be used. And the cards change depending on what cards are in front of it and beside it. As an example, I have the deck right in front of me here. The Five of Spades, the meaning behind it, if it's turned right way up, is baggage, bringing to carry. But if beside it at some point is the Ten of Clubs, that means a voyage. Or if any of the cards beside it are either a 4, 6, or 7 of spades, that means lies. The thing that is the most mind-blowing for me, and something that I haven't seen from any other deck, is that Austin has small little illustrations on the cards that overlap on the boundary of the card itself, that if you have another card that also has drawings on the boundary, the two will link up and make a small little sketch or a small little illustration there, and that itself will have a different meaning. Now, Austin, of course, didn't come up with this. There were cards produced, I believe, in the early 20th century that, not for cardamancy, at least I don't believe it was mainly designed for cardamancy, in which people could make different pictures by putting different little cards next to each other. I believe it came out in France or something like that. Or I don't know if Austin ever saw these kind of cards, but what you have, again, is somebody who is just trying to really push the format of tarot cards into a brand new thing. The canvas is no longer the canvas. The canvas of the card has been expanded. These cards can mean so many different things in so many different ways. I'm not at a loss for words. It's just so simple and brilliant. You just see somebody who's very young and somewhat anarchic with their approach to art that saw these things, these blank cards, as a playground in which he could have many images and many different meanings, almost a dizzying amount of meanings and interpretations that is also reflected with his own style of arts. There's some cards where if you put 5 or 6 of them together in a row, they'll have a picture of a snake. I mean, imagine, the odds are against it, but imagine if you have those cards come up and there's a snake. I mean, what does that do for your reading? It is so hard to try and encapsulate why I think this deck is just so unbelievably brilliant and such a breath of fresh air. And I'm shocked that more people haven't done this kind of thing. And truthfully, since Austin did this, there have been some decks, I am very well aware, that some folks have released things kind of in and along these lines, but not to the extent that Austin has with his tarot deck. This thing is blazingly original and uncompromisingly inspirational. It's a bit of a shame that this deck is not more available for folks. It's hard to find. It's hard to get a hold of. Because in my opinion, this incredible story of how we got this deck and how I can actually have it in my hands to do readings should be a clarion call for what I believe to be a somewhat stagnant world of cardamancy right now. I really don't want people to think that, I think that everything that comes out sucks right now. I think that we have some of the most brilliant artwork produced in cardamancy and within tarot. It's really quite amazing, but I don't really see anybody pushing the medium, or the format. This object, made over 100 years ago as kind of just a curiosity, as a canvas for experimentation, not only for Austin's art, but for Austin's nascent occultism, is the kick in the pants that I think cardamancy needs right now. Even if it wasn't Austin who made this deck, I still think it is one of the most inspirational magical artifacts that we have over the last 125 years. You might say that's a bit of an exaggeration. I truly absolutely think so. I've had this thing for over 2 years. I've been able to sit with it and meet with it on its own terms. Every single time that I do it and I spend time with this deck, the magic and creativity absolutely leaks out of it. It makes me want to be more magical. It is a relic from the past that was resurrected in the present that shows a way for cardamancy's future. Not to belabor the point, I just am absolutely stunned by this thing. I think it is astounding. We don't really know too much as to what Austin thought about his deck, but all I can say from my end is that it's probably the most unique cardamancy deck I have ever come across. So where are we at? Where are we at these days? Where do we stand and situate ourselves right now? I had somebody ask me recently if I had done that time-honored tradition within Western occultism, well, just basically since the 19th century, that one should create their own tarot deck, or just some kind of deck used for cardamancy. And I replied that I did. This was ages ago. It was shite. I think it was terrible. It was basically just a ripoff of Aleister Crowley and Lady Frida Harris's deck, the Thoth deck. It wasn't good. I can't draw. I tried to draw. I hated it. I created it, and I thought it was bad, and I think I threw it out pretty quickly. From what I remember, I think I just trashed it. Yet in the week since I received that question, I've had to kind of rethink a lot of my, shall I say, more magical curmudgeon stances. Because if you were to ask me a year ago if everybody should make a deck for cardamancy, I would have said, nah, you don't need to. Not really. It's not really that important. The last 2 months have had me absolutely obsessed with cards and art and artists, the importance of playing cards to my life, the things that one can get from engaging in this practice of cardamancy. And now I think if cardamancy is interesting to you, and if it is one of those things that has been a part of your life, I mean playing cards specifically here, then you probably should make your own cardamantic deck. It doesn't have to be a tarot deck. It doesn't have to be either 52 cards like your standard playing card deck. It doesn't have to be 78 cards, the kind of standard we have for tarot right now. These things can be literally whatever you want it to be. The restrictions are just ones that are seemingly arbitrary at this point. When I hold Austin Osman Spare's cards in my hand, I see that the limitations are only the ones that we put on ourselves. It is the act of creation and experimentation that gives these things their own unique form of magic. I've been thinking I probably should make myself some kind of cardamancy deck. In a way, it's been eating away at me over the last 3 weeks. I literally had a dream a couple of days ago that I created my own style of cardamantic deck. All right. Hang with me, everybody. Okay, just see what happens. Dreams, again, are very, very important, as I have said over and over and over again since day one of this podcast. But in my dream, I created a deck of cardamancy cards in which the cards themselves were perfectly square, and that they would do that thing that Austin did in his deck, where the edge of the card could in fact link up with the edge of another card if they were placed beside it or above it or in any one of the sides of the squares. And here's the kicker. The theme of the deck itself was vintage Super Mario Brothers. You all know, like the 1985, ridiculously but just so awesomely pixelated video game, home console video game made for the Nintendo Entertainment System. God, I loved Mario so much when I was younger. Anyhow, the things that would link one side of the card with the other were those green pipes. they have a term. Everybody should know what they're called, right? They're called warp pipes. They would take Super Mario to different places. I know you all know what I'm talking about here. And depending on how many of these cards you lay down, you'd lay down these square cards in a square, and you'd have the one card that you start with. That card that you start with would obviously have one of those entry warp pipe illustrations that would obviously lead to one of the edges of the card. And then from that entry warp pipe, you would trace it along other cards so long as they are actually connected, connected like pipes would be. They would twist and turn in direction on the cards, obviously at 90-degree angles. And then they would eventually lead to an exit warp pipe that would have some kind of other infamous Super Mario icon on there, like a piranha plant, or, oh my goodness, it's the angry sun. That means that the angry sun. I hope everybody knows what I'm talking about here. It's that sun that tries to get you in Super Mario 3, right? That's a bad divinatory omen. Of course, the divination would only count if the pipes are actually connected to its starting point. Anyhow, it makes sense in my brain. After I woke up from this dream, I was like, oh man, I could do this. I could make this. I could make money from this. Well, Nintendo would make money from this. Anyways, you heard it all here first, everybody. Super Mario Tarot. Super Mario Brothers Warp Pipe Tarot. Coming soon. Destined to be a cardamantic standard like the Petit Lenormand or the Waite Smith deck. Oracle decks, get fucked. You all know what divinatory meaning you get when you land on a Koopa Troopa. All right, I'm getting a bit carried away here. This is supposed to be serious. This podcast is supposed to be a serious thing. All joking aside here, and I actually truly did dream this, but that's what happens. I have been looking at this stuff for the last 2 months, and it has ignited a real creative fire within me that is very obviously leaking into my dream world, and it's all wonderful, and it's all great. That is part of the power of cardamancy. So I think I'd have to tell my younger self that they need to shut the fuck up when it comes to if one should create their own deck. I think you should. If cards are important to you, you owe this tradition, a tradition that is not just relegated to the world of the occult and magic, but to games and to fun. Cardamancers should have their own deck. Get going. Start now. Start thinking about it. Just do it. Make it fun. Make it weird. Be as creative as you can and try to push the format in interesting directions. Not to toot my own horn, for the last 12 years, one of my favorite things to interact with magically has been a Ouija, using Ouija boards. Here's the thing, though. I don't actually have an Ouija board. Well, I don't have that thing that exists in your mind, what you think of as an Ouija board. My Ouija board is actually a pack of cards. Well, to be more specific, it is a pack of blank cards that I've made into an Ouija board. And I'm not sure what it is about the Ouija board that I created from playing cards. It just might be because I love cards, but I find the things that I get from interacting with this homemade card Ouija board to be head and shoulders better than anything that I could purchase from Etsy or from eBay or anything like that. I even showed the Patreon supporters how they can make an Ouija board of their own. It's a video that I have on my Patreon. If you want to see that, $7 a month. Very easy. It's in the show notes for this episode. Come on down. It's awesome. Get to learn how to make a portable Ouija board. What can I say? But I just remember in the act of coming up with that Ouija board using playing cards was an incredibly magically fertile period of my life. And when I first used it, the results were so unbelievably staggering and real. It almost seemed unreal. Now, I know that using playing cards for an Ouija board is not an original. I'm not claiming that that is, something that I thought of. Trademark, it's all mine, it's all me, me, me. That's not the point. While thinking about it, creating it, being somewhat artistic in where certain things were going to go was the creation of a story. It was a wonderful process, a very creative process. That's where you need to aim. That's where you need to be. It's not the thing itself. It's how you go about doing it and creating it, and that being also part of how you interact with it. As far as cardamancy is concerned, go crazy with it. Be clever and cunning and creative. We need some new shit around these parts. And once you're done, you need to share it. And you need to use it. And preferably, I think some aspect that we've lost a bit, and I've mentioned it earlier in this podcast, some part of this whole thing that we've lost is fortune-telling as a spectator sport. I think one-on-one readings are tired. I want to see more cardomancers out there in public. And I know some people are going to email me, Doug, I've been doing readings in cafes. I know you exist. Thank you. We need more of you out there in the public's eye, doing some really weird stuff, but more than anything, making sure that not just you, but the people you're doing your fortune telling with are all having, for the most part, fun. I started this podcast with the thesis that playing cards have been magical right from the outset. I truly think that. Something about these things we can't really explain at this point. People have tried, and all of the explanations are really boring. But something about these papers, these stacks of cardstock, have us completely entranced. It's not just that we like games and gambling. That's part of it. Something about the object itself, its tactile nature, what happens to these things when you have them in your hand and you take them and flick them onto a table. That sound, they have a true spell over us. That very aspect, that very initial feeling that we got when we first started holding these things in our hands has just entranced us in a way that very few other things have. Yet the physical nature of these things is not just the only magic. It's the initial magic, but the lasting, enduring magic of these things is what happens when you interact with them, either with yourself, but specifically, and for the most part, with other people. If there's one message I want each person listening to this episode to get, is the most important factor and element in cardamancy is the cards and what you do with them. It's the how of cardamancy, which is the same as the how of playing with these things. It's a game. For the most part, games should be fun. Something incredible happens when we play games. It's something that we're not really too sure why it happens, but the creation of enjoyment and amusement and fun that comes as a consequence of creating and engaging in games is one of the most magical interactions that we have. It's one of those things like listening to music that is unexplainable, but for those of us that do play games of any sort, that take each and every participant from something that seems unreal and arbitrary into the realms of possibility, strategy, and the improbable. And it's one of those things that I've heard many people talk about, and it doesn't seem to matter what kind of game you're interacting with, be it a card game or be it a tabletop role-playing game that you've been playing with others for weeks. You know it when you see it, because I know if you have played games, this has happened, that sometimes the game takes a life of its own. Certain things seem to happen that seem beyond chance, that seem beyond coincidence. The game has a life. If a lot of what we do as magicians, the magic of making the unreal real and the impossible possible, a lot of it has to do with creation and story. Two elements integral to not just games, but any act of divination. Perhaps one of the keys, I think, that has been missing, one of the things that I think a lot of people have yet to grasp about all of this stuff is that just as important as it is approaching your magic as an ongoing journey and story, an ongoing game of some sort, your rituals, our performances, our stories, that equal to that is how you feel while you're engaging with it. While your story is currently being told, while that scroll is being unrolled, it should be fun. Throw yourself into the stories, into the game. Give in to the easy abandon that you can have when you're enjoying what you're doing. The greatest gift of cardamancy is there in your hands. It just maybe seems that sometimes we forget. It's time to play. Magic needs to be fun. And that, my beauties, is all I have for this episode. I didn't want to overcomplicate things, and I am being entirely sincere in that last sentiment. Games and enjoyment and the story of what happens when you engage in games and are having fun at the same time are just so integral, I think, to cardamancy and to divination and fortune telling, and by proxy, magic in general, your ongoing magic. If you're already playing games, good on you. That's excellent. I mean, preferably, I know I said, like, yeah, any game is great. It's true. Any game is really, really good. But I will say, but games played with others in the room with you, that's the best. That's the sweet spot. That's where you can actually do that thing that I know has happened to you. You can see it happen in front of you. You can see the game just take on some other thing. It has a life of its own, and it's so beautiful when it happens. So get out there, start playing some games, family, friends, whoever. If you don't have any friends, find a card club. They exist. Get out there. I know you can do it. I love you. There's fun to be had. All right. Let's talk about some show notes. Holy crap. I believe I have close to 50 show notes that are available. If something I've talked about today interested you and you're like, man, I'd like to see that. I want to see that deck that Doug was talking about. Guess what? It's in the show notes to this episode. And yeah, with something like cardamancy and talking about decks of cards, it really does help if you can visually see them. I've got you all covered. Head to whatmagicisthis.com. Find the episode, the history of cardamancy. The show notes for this episode are awesome. It's all there. Have fun. Enjoy yourself. Again, I would like to say, if you have not found Mary K. Greer's tarot blog, shame on you. You owe it to yourself to go to this blog. The absolute best. And again, this episode would not exist without the work that Mary did. Fantastic. Pretty much the greatest resource that we have right now online for cardamancy and its history. Mary has done the work. Everybody, check it out. Links will be in the show notes, or head to marykgreer.com. Yeah, please head to the show notes for this episode. There's going to be something there that you're going to think is really, really cool. And if you like playing cards, man, you'll want to check out these show notes. Trust me. Just trust me. Even if you don't like cards, check out my show notes. whatmagicisthis.com. All right, then. Hey, do you think that what I'm doing with this podcast is fun and awesome, and you enjoy what I do, and you would like to show your support in some way? Because again, this is my job. This is what I do for a living. It is my passion. I absolutely love it. And yes, if you're listening to this new, this episode certainly did take a long time. That is because I care so much about the information and the way I'm trying to present it to you. I take my time because I care, and it is always about quality over quantity. If you dig that, and you want to dig Doug, if you want to dig what Doug does, you want to show your support in some way, there's 4 ways of doing that. Let's go through it as we do. The first way is the absolute best way, and that is, of course, my Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on any number of the support me on Patreon buttons there. I've put them everywhere. My page is littered with the support me on Patreon buttons. The reason? Because again, this is my job. It is only $7 a month. When I started the Patreon, I set it at $7 a month. It is now 2026. It's been well over 5 years since I've had that Patreon. It is still $7. Why? Because I want you to join my Patreon. The reason is because I think it is awesome and it's very different, and we go in depth on so many different wonderful things. As mentioned earlier, I've got a video on how to make your own Ouija board out of playing cards. I have videos on how to make incense, set up an ancestral altar, how to interact with Saint Expedite, how to make your own magic circle for something like evocatory Solomonic magic. Not only just videos, I've got audio episodes. The audio episodes are basically like a different podcast. It's a whole other podcast. I love it because I get to have fun with it. I get to play with the format of podcasts a little bit more, but that doesn't mean that what I'm doing is entirely experimental and not interesting. They really are. I share stories about certain magical events and situations. I've got episodes about certain gods or goddesses. I've done shows where I talk about certain saints, certain demons, angels even. You know how much I like books. I've got episodes about books that I think that you need to own in your library right now. In my opinion, my best work is on Patreon. This stuff is fun and it's good, but my best stuff is always there on the Patreon. It's only $7 a month. I would love to have your support. And truly, it is the best way of supporting me. It keeps me doing this thing that you enjoy, but as a bonus, when you do support me, you get access to basically a whole different show. Once again, $7, one tier, patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com. Find any number of the links there. If you don't feel like signing up for the monthly thing, $7 a month, I also have a PayPal account. If you head to whatmagicisthis.com, you'll find all the buttons there that say PayPal or just has two P's. PP. Yeah, click that. Yes, that's right. I made a PP joke. Have I done that before on this? I do a lot of these sign-outs. That might be the first time. If not, apologies. I'm not doing this to shame anybody. Somebody actually wrote me. Here's the thing. Somebody actually donated money to my PayPal. Thank you, thank you. I'm saying this, thank you. I'm not trying to shame you in any way, shape, or form. I'm doing this in the spirit of fun. They donated some money through PayPal after my last episode about Pamela Coleman Smith. They said, great episode, except for your blowjob joke. That was not to my taste. So here I am, making a PP joke about PayPal. Yes, indeed. Oh, the fun we have. Anyhow, any and all donations through PayPal are appreciated. It just goes right back into making sure that this podcast has all of its plugins and its editing software and things like that, because everything's on a subscription model these days, which sucks. Who was the first? Was Adobe the first group to do that with programs? If they were, fuck you. Now everyone's doing it and it sucks. Anyhow, yes, if you donate through PayPal, it basically goes to make this podcast run. It keeps the hamster on the wheel, keeps the coal in the furnace. Any and all donations are appreciated. Thank you so very, very much. Do you like books? Do you like buying books? I know you do. But do you also like supporting your favorite podcaster? And do you also like putting some money back into the local economy and helping independent booksellers? Well, you can do all of those things at the same time if you head to whatmagicisthis.com and head to my online bookshop. You see, I've got an online bookshop that I run through bookshop.org. If I've talked about a book, or if you find a book in the show notes, something that you want to purchase, most likely you will find that book in the show notes to the episode. You click it, it'll take you to my bookshop. You'll be able to buy it. It gets sold to you by an independent bookstore, so they get a little bit of money. Bookshop.org, because they hosted those books on their website, get a little bit of money. And I get a little bit of money because I recommended it to you. Everybody wins, and you get yourself an awesome book. So yes, 2 ways of doing that. Head to the show notes. If you click on any number of the books that are listed there, it'll take you to my bookshop.org link, or head to whatmagicisthis.com. Go to the menu there, or go to the very bottom of the homepage, and you will find a link for my bookshop. Grab yourself some books. You're keeping the literary heritage of Western magic and the occult alive by doing so. You're also just helping me a little bit. The final way of supporting what I do is not the greatest financially, but my gosh, I love it when people buy merchandise. That's right. Do you want a hoodie? Do you want coffee mugs? Do you want tote bags? Do you want a t-shirt? Do you want a throw pillow? I have all of these things. I have a store, a merchandise store through tpublic.com. Go to whatmagicisthis.com, click on the menu, click on merchandise. You can get any of those things. There's a lot of really fun designs there, almost about 15 designs, or maybe even more than 15. I forget. Grab yourself something. And once you do, make sure you take a picture of it and send it to me. I absolutely love seeing people in my stuff. It is one of my greatest joys in life when somebody has one of my t-shirts. It's the greatest thing ever. Again, I only get a little bit of money every time you order a t-shirt. Most of it goes to TeePublic. That's just the agreement. But I understand that such things are also very good promotion, and it's great when you walk around with a What Magic Is This hoodie and somebody's like, hey, what magic is this? And you give them the finger guns with both hands. Hey, it's a podcast. The best podcast in the history of podcasting. Check it out, you lucky so-and-so. It's bound to happen. Truly, that whole situation, bound to happen if you grab one of my pieces of merchandise. Are we past 3 hours? Oh, yeah. All right, I just see I passed the 3-hour mark on this episode. Ooh, this might be the longest episode of What Magic Is This podcast. Wow, making history here, folks. Anyhow, merchandise is great. I love seeing people in it. Grab yourself something. I know there's something that you want, and most likely there is a design that you really connect with. Please, it would be greatly appreciated. But of all of these things and all of these ways of supporting me and helping What Magic Is This continue to produce 3-hour-long episodes every, month, a month and a half currently, best way of doing that is through Patreon. Once again, patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and find yourself any number of those support me on Patreon links. Truly appreciate it. Cannot wait for you to see how awesome things over there are on the Patreon. And I can't wait for you to see how awesome the show notes are as well for this episode. Please do yourself a favor. Check them out. Everything, as always, is on whatmagicisthis.com. That is it for this episode, my pretties. If you're listening to this fresh, as in April of 2026, thank you so much for your patience. There was some stuff that I had to do as far as visiting family, and I just got carried away. Actually, truthfully, here's the real story of this episode. Not that you care, but I'm going to tell it anyway. Originally, this episode started off as an episode on the Petite Lenormand. Then I was like, while doing the research, there probably wasn't enough to do a whole episode of the show on. Then I was just like, well, what about cards? What's it about these things that is just so weird and fascinating and awesome? And why do I love playing them? And I've always loved playing them. And, well, it just came to be that, you know what? I've already done an episode about the history of tarot. That's only part of the story. Tarot is, as far as used for Western occult tradition, is fairly new. Let's talk about everything. Let's talk about cardamancy in general. And so that's basically what happened. So I did a whole bunch of work on the Petite Lenormand, and then I switched gears, scrapped it, decided that there wasn't enough there, so might as well do an episode about the history of cardamancy. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a bucket of fun to research. Truly one of the more fun times I have had doing research. I know I say that for a lot of episodes, but that's how I know that I'm on the right path as far as, the shows that I'm doing. If I have a great time doing the research and formulating the show, then I know that most likely I've got something pretty good for each and every one of you and your ear holes. All right, enough about your ear holes. Let's wrap this one up. Thank you, each and every one of you, for listening. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I will do that thing I do each and every one of these podcast episodes and say I hope that each and every one of you stays healthy, stays hopeful, and stays luminous. Until next time, everybody, go out, make yourself a deck. I know you wanna. All right. Stay luminous, everyone. Ta.